Section 1. The Man, the Myth, the Belly. Picture this. It is a quiet weeknight somewhere in Rhode Island. The kind of night where the autumn air has just started to carry that particular chill that makes you want to pull a blanket tighter across your lap without actually getting up to find a heavier one. The leaves on the elm trees along Spooner Street have begun their slow turn from green to amber, and the sky is that deep, navy darkness that only really arrives in New England, where there are still enough places between the towns for stars to have room to breathe. The neighborhood is quiet the way suburbs get quiet around 9 in the evening, when the last dogs have been walked and the last cars have pulled into the last driveways, and the only light coming from the windows is the specific, shifting blue-white flicker of televisions doing their quiet work. And there, in one particular house at number 31, in a living room that perpetually smells faintly of beer and old upholstery, and the ghost of some specific casserole from 2 Tuesdays ago, a large man is asleep on a beige couch. His mouth is open just slightly. One arm has fallen off the couch entirely and hangs toward the carpet in a pose of absolute surrender. His glasses are still on his face, because he didn't so much decide to fall asleep as simply cease to be awake. The television is still going. Some program he was watching has long since finished and given way to something else entirely, and it doesn't matter one bit because he stopped watching approximately 40 minutes ago. And the transition from there to here was so gradual and so complete that nobody, including him, noticed the exact moment when watching became sleeping. The man is at peace. He is Peter Griffin, and in this moment, in this very specific and unhurried moment, he has achieved something that ancient philosophers spent entire lifetimes chasing. He has found rest. Now you might be laughing at that framing, and that is completely fine, because this entire conversation we are about to have is going to live somewhere in that comfortable space between a joke and something genuinely true. Peter Griffin is not a philosopher in any conventional sense. He has never read Aristotle. He couldn't pick Epicurus out of a lineup. The Stoics are not something he has ever thought about. Not even once. The name Marcus Aurelius would ring no bells. Immanuel Kant would ring no bells. If you put the Tao Te Ching in front of him, he would probably wonder if it was a menu from a restaurant he hadn't tried yet. And yet, when you sit down and look very carefully at the way Peter Griffin moves through the world, when you study the actual mechanics of his daily existence and the specific logic that drives his decisions, when you look at the shape of his life stripped of all the comedy and the chaos and the spectacular disasters, something strange and almost beautiful starts to emerge. Peter Griffin, more or less accidentally, has built a life around a set of principles that have kept serious thinkers busy for over 2,000 years. This is a long, slow, gentle exploration of that idea. And the way we are going to approach it is not by pretending Peter is wise in the way we usually mean that word, because he isn't. He is, by most measurable standards, one of the least conventionally wise characters ever to appear in the history of animated television. His IQ has been tested on screen and found to sit just below the clinical threshold for intellectual disability. He once spent an entire day convinced that his kneecap had a personal grudge against him. He has picked fights with a giant chicken on many separate occasions for reasons that, in the cold light of logic, make very little sense. He occasionally forgets that he has a daughter. He once declared his house an independent nation, complete with its own foreign policy. He has, multiple times, been surprised to learn basic facts about the physical world that most adults absorbed before the age of 7. But here's the thing about wisdom that gets lost when people try too hard to chase it. It doesn't always arrive wearing robes and carrying a staff. Sometimes it arrives in white sneakers and a green shirt, holding a bottle of Pawtucket Patriot Ale, and absolutely convinced that the movie it just watched was the greatest thing ever committed to celluloid, even if the movie had a 34% critical score, and everyone in the room is quietly wondering who recommended it. Wisdom, in its quieter and more accidental forms, is sometimes just the ability to be fully where you are without torturing yourself about where you're not. And Peter Griffin, whatever else you want to say about him, is almost never anywhere other than exactly where he is. Seth MacFarlane created this character in 1999 after studying at the Rhode Island School of Design, where he made short animated films that would eventually become the blueprint for Family Guy. The earliest version of Peter was a character named Larry, from a 1995 short called The Life of Larry, made as part of MacFarlane's student work. Larry was a middle-aged, slightly rumpled everyman who lived with a talking dog named Steve. McFarlane pitched a developed version to Fox in 1998, changed the names, built a full family around the central relationship, and on the 31st of January, 1999, the world met Peter Griffin for the first time, right after Super Bowl 33 ended, and 22 million people were still sitting in front of their televisions. 22 million viewers on that first night. One of the most watched debuts in animated television history. And what those viewers saw was something that looked, at first glance, familiar. A large, slightly dopey father. A wife who was clearly smarter and more patient than he deserved. 3 kids navigating the chaos he generated. A dog who could talk, drink martinis, and had clearly read things. The setting was suburban Rhode Island, a very specific place with a very specific texture. Blue collar, Catholic, small city New England. Not quite Boston, not quite Providence, somewhere in between, with the particular accents and particular bars and particular loyalties of that region. The humor was sharp and strange from the very beginning. The cutaway gags in those early seasons were used as seasoning rather than as the main course. The characters had more room to breathe, more room to have actual conversations and actual feelings before the episode pivoted to chaos. But the character at the center of it all was the piece that kept people coming back, because Peter Griffin wasn't just a buffoon. In those early seasons especially, he was something more specific and more interesting than that. He was a man who had, through some combination of limited intellectual range and genuinely high contentment, arrived at a way of living that people with far more expansive intellectual range spend enormous amounts of energy trying to construct deliberately. He wasn't trying to be happy. He just was, in his way, on his own terms. And those terms had their own quiet coherence, their own internal logic, their own accidental philosophy. Let us slow down for a moment and just look at Peter's daily life as a kind of map. He wakes up every morning in the same house. He has the same wife, who has by this point loved him for decades through genuinely extraordinary levels of provocation. He drives the same route to a job he has held, in various capacities, for most of his adult life. He goes to the same bar almost every evening after work, sits at the same bar stool, drinks the same beer, and talks to the same 3 men he has been friends with since what feels like the beginning of time. He watches the same kind of television he has always watched. He eats food that he genuinely enjoys without performing guilt about it. He sleeps without apparent difficulty. He wakes up and does it again. This is, on the surface, a life of very low variation. If you described it without the comedy attached, it might even sound monotonous. A man, a house, a bar, a job, repeat. But here is what the great Stoic thinkers and the Buddhist teachers, and the practitioners of contemplative traditions across cultures have long understood about this kind of life. The deepest contentment available to a human being rarely comes from novelty. It comes from sufficiency. It comes from recognizing that you already have enough to be at peace, and then actually being at peace, rather than just intellectually acknowledging that you should be. Peter doesn't intellectually acknowledge that he should be content with beer and television, and the company of his 3 closest friends and a warm house. He just is content with those things. Bone deep, unself-conscious, uncomplicated content. And that is philosophically remarkable, because most human beings, given the same objective circumstances, cannot stop the mind from restlessly pointing towards something that isn't there yet. Something better, something more, some other version of the life that would finally make everything feel the way it is supposed to feel. Peter has no such restlessness. His version of the examined life involves primarily examining whether the beer is cold and whether the channel he wants is on. This sounds like a joke, and it is a joke. The entire premise of this series is that Peter's life is funny. But underneath the joke, underneath the pratfalls and the chicken fights and the terrible decisions, there is a genuine and somewhat startling piece at the center of this character that the best philosophers in history would look at and recognize as something they spent decades trying to cultivate. There is a concept in ancient Greek philosophy called eudaimonia. It is usually translated as happiness, but the translation loses quite a bit. The full meaning of eudaimonia is something closer to flourishing, living in accordance with your deepest nature in a sustained and meaningful way. Not pleasure spikes, not achievement highs, not the temporary satisfaction of getting what you wanted. a background condition of being well suited to your own life, of living in a way that fits who you actually are rather than who you think you're supposed to be. Aristotle believed eudaimonia was the highest human good. He believed it was achieved through the cultivation of virtue, through excellent friendships, through rational engagement with the world, and through living in a community that supported and was supported by your flourishing. He wrote about it in the Nicomachean Ethics in a register of seriousness and careful thinking that is as far from Quahog, Rhode Island, as it is possible to get. And yet the strange thing about Peter Griffin, when you look at his life through this lens, is that he has several of the basic components that Aristotle identified. He has a family that, in its chaotic and frequently disastrous way, genuinely loves him and is loved in return. He has friendships of a depth and consistency that most people spend their whole lives hoping for. He has work that, while not particularly meaningful to him intellectually, gives his day structure and his identity coherence. He has a community in Quahog that knows him and around which he is known. He has pleasures that are modest and reliably accessible, which means the gap between wanting and having stays small. He has, in other words, the scaffold of a flourishing life. The problem is that he keeps trying to demolish the scaffold. The comedy is about the demolition, but the philosophy is about the scaffold. And the scaffold keeps getting rebuilt, episode after episode, season after season, because it has to. Because without it, Peter would have nothing to fall from and no place to return to. The scaffold is the point. We are going to move through all of this slowly tonight. 10 sections, each one looking at a different angle of Peter Griffin's accidental inner life. The pleasure angle, the time angle, the friendship angle, the ambition angle, the love angle, the chaos angle, the class angle, the paradox angle, the comedy angle. And before we get to any of them, right here at the start, I want to ask you to do 2 things. First, drop a comment somewhere below this video. Just tell us where in the world you're watching from and what time it is where you are. It is a small thing, but there is something genuinely beautiful about the idea of people in hundreds of different places and different time zones watching the same thing at the same moment, each of them in their own quiet room, each of them winding down for the night. That is its own kind of community, its own small drunken clam. And if you haven't already, subscribe, so this kind of long, slow, thoughtful video finds you again when you need it. And now let's go deeper. Let's go all the way back to a garden in Athens in the 4th century BC, and a man who had something to say about pleasure that Peter Griffin has been accidentally demonstrating for 25 years. Section 2. The Gospel of Simple Pleasures. Peter as Accidental Epicurean. There is a garden in Athens that no longer exists in any physical form, but which has existed continuously in the history of ideas for over 2,000 years. The man who built it was named Epicurus, and he founded his school there around 307 BC. The school was called simply the Garden, and it was unusual for its time in several respects. It admitted women on equal terms with men, which was radical in 4th century Athens. It admitted slaves. It was not attached to any official civic institution. It ran on donations and communal meals rather than fees. And its primary subject of inquiry was not logic or mathematics or cosmology, though Epicurus had views on all of those things. Its primary subject of inquiry was pleasure, how to have it, how to sustain it, what it actually was beneath all the assumptions people brought to the word. Epicurus began with what he considered a simple and irrefutable observation about human beings. We are pleasure-seeking, pain-avoiding creatures. This is not a character flaw. It is not something to be overcome or transcended. It is simply the nature of what we are. Every motivation, if you trace it far enough back, arrives at this basic fact. We want to feel good and we want to avoid feeling bad. The question that interested Epicurus was not whether this was true, because he thought it was obviously true, but what it meant about how to live well. His answer surprised people then, and it surprises people now, because the word Epicurean has come to mean something almost exactly opposite to what Epicurus himself taught. When people say something is Epicurean today, they usually mean it is luxurious. Rich food, fine wine, expensive holidays, elaborate sensory indulgence. The word has been colonized by a version of pleasure-seeking that Epicurus himself explicitly argued against. What Epicurus actually believed was this: the pleasures most reliably worth pursuing are the simple ones. Not because luxury is morally wrong, but because luxury creates problems that simple pleasures don't. Luxury requires wealth, which requires effort and anxiety. It creates expectations that escalate over time, so that what once satisfied no longer does. It introduces what Epicurus called kinetic pleasures, pleasures that arise from active striving and stimulation, and these pleasures carry within them their own dissatisfaction because they always point towards something not yet acquired, something not yet experienced. The pleasures Epicurus preferred were what he called katastematic pleasures, pleasures of stable being rather than active striving. Ataraxia, which means freedom from anxiety or disturbance. Aponia, which means freedom from bodily pain. In their positive forms, these translate to something like a comfortable body, a settled mind, the company of people you love, food that is enough, shelter that is warm. He genuinely believed that a person who had these things and recognized that they had them was wealthier, in the only sense that mattered, than a person with enormous material resources who was perpetually anxious about losing them or perpetually striving for more. He was, in short, describing Peter Griffin. Let us look carefully at how Peter Griffin relates to pleasure, because it is actually quite specific and quite revealing. Peter's primary pleasures are beer, television, his friends, food, and the occasional grand scheme that usually ends in catastrophe. He does not want for exotic things. He does not lie awake at night wishing he were somewhere else. He does not read about the lifestyles of wealthy people and feel the particular hollowness of comparison. He watches television because he likes watching television. He drinks beer because he likes drinking beer. When Pawtucket Patriot Ale is in his hand, and the New England Patriots are on the screen, and Joe and Quagmire and Cleveland are around him, he is satisfied in a way that is complete and uncomplicated. This sounds trivial. It is presented as trivial by the show, or at least as the premise upon which more interesting things are built. But Epicurus would not have found it trivial. Epicurus would have looked at Peter Griffin's relationship with beer and the television and felt something close to professional admiration. Here, he might have said, is a man who has correctly identified the upper limit of what pleasure needs to be. Here is a man who has not made the ancient and almost universal human mistake of assuming that more would be better. The mistake Epicurus worried about most was what happens when human beings cannot accept the sufficiency of what they already have. He called the restless desire for more by a name that translates roughly as the unlimited desire for what is not necessary. He thought it was the single greatest source of human misery, not because the things being desired were bad in themselves, but because the desiring could not stop. Because people who had not learned to find the upper limit of their own satisfaction were condemned to a kind of permanent hunger, always eating but never feeling full. Peter has found his upper limit. He doesn't know he's found it. He has no philosophical vocabulary for what he's done. But structurally, functionally, in the way his life actually runs from morning to evening, he has done the thing that Epicurus spent his whole life trying to teach people to do. Now it gets more interesting when we look at how Epicurus thought about specific pleasures in relation to pain. He made a distinction that is subtle but important. Some pleasures, he argued, are worth pursuing even when they come with a cost, because the pleasure outweighs the pain. Some pleasures are not worth pursuing because the cost exceeds the benefit. And some pleasures are worth pursuing precisely because they have no cost at all. Beer has a cost. It has a caloric cost and a health cost, and, at sufficient quantities, a morning cost. Television has an opportunity cost. Peter pays these costs. He pays them cheerfully, which is philosophically interesting, because cheerful payment of a cost suggests that the pleasure was correctly valued relative to the price. He is not drinking beer in the tortured way of someone who knows they should stop but can't. He is drinking beer in the uncomplicated way of someone who has weighed the beer against its cost and found the beer worth it, and then stopped thinking about it. This is what the Stoics called preferred indifference, things that are not necessary for the good life, but which, when available, can be accepted and enjoyed without attachment. Peter's beer is a preferred indifferent. His television is a preferred indifferent. The difference between Peter and a person tormented by their beer is that Peter has no attachment to the beer as a concept. When it's there, he enjoys it. If it were gone, he would want it, but he wouldn't be undone by it. The enjoyment is clean. It does not carry within it the anxiety of loss. There is a story from the Epicurean tradition about how Epicurus lived. He reportedly ate barley bread and olives and drank water. And he wrote that he felt no need for elaborate food because simple food, when eaten with genuine attention and genuine appetite, produced a pleasure equal to any feast. He invited friends to bring a bit of cheese when they came to visit, so that when it occasionally appeared on the table, it was a genuine addition rather than a constant expectation. He wanted the cheese to be a gift rather than a baseline. He wanted the pleasure to be real rather than numbed by repetition. This is, structurally, how Peter experiences Pawtucket Patriot Ale. The beer is not a sophisticated pleasure. It is not expensive or rare or crafted with unusual attention. It is a mass-market regional beer from a fictional Rhode Island brewery, and it is exactly the right beer for Peter Griffin because its simplicity matches his simplicity, and the pleasure is proportionally correct. He is not performing appreciation of the beer. He is not constructing an identity around the beer. He is just drinking it and finding it good, and that goodness is complete. Let's also think about Peter's relationship with food, because food is where his Epicurean instincts are perhaps most visible. Peter Griffin loves food. He loves it openly and without aesthetic pretension. He loves sandwiches with an earnestness that most food critics reserve for tasting menus at Michelin-starred restaurants. He has been shown eating with the same undisguised enthusiasm, whether the food is a gas station hot dog or Thanksgiving dinner, or a piece of leftover pizza that has been in the refrigerator for an uncertain number of days. His palate is not discriminating, but his enjoyment is genuine. And this, Epicurus would point out, is the entire point. The discriminating palate, once cultivated, becomes its own burden. It sets a threshold below which ordinary food cannot pass, which means that the range of pleasurable eating experiences narrows even as the sophistication supposedly increases. Peter has no such problem. Peter can find genuine pleasure in a bologna sandwich. His range of pleasurable eating experiences is vast precisely because his standards are low, and his standards being low is not a failure of taste but a feature of his relationship with appetite. He wants things he can have. He enjoys things when he has them. This cycle works. Epicurus also wrote about what he called the pleasures of the mind, by which he primarily meant philosophy and friendship, and he rated these above the pleasures of the body, not because physical pleasure was shameful, but because the mind's pleasures were more sustainable and more under one's control. You could be ill and still have good conversation. You could be poor and still have excellent friendship. The pleasures of the body were contingent on physical circumstances. The pleasures of the mind were more weather-resistant. Peter's version of mental pleasure is considerably less highbrow than what Epicurus had in mind. He does not debate ideas over wine in an Athenian garden. He watches television and makes observations about it that are frequently wrong and occasionally, by accident, completely correct. But the function is similar. The mind, finding something to chew on, producing in response to it a feeling of engagement and presence that is its own form of pleasure. When Peter watches the New England Patriots and explains, confidently and incorrectly, some aspect of strategy to whoever is near him, he is experiencing the pleasure of engaged attention. When he watches a movie and then tells everyone he meets about it for the next 48 hours, he is experiencing the pleasure of an impression that has organized itself into enthusiasm. These are not refined mental pleasures. They are not what Epicurus was envisioning, but they are real. They are genuine. They are Peter doing what minds do when they are at rest and at play. The ancient philosopher Lucretius, one of the great inheritors of Epicurean thought, wrote in his long poem De Rerum Natura about the quiet pleasure of watching a storm from the safety of shore, not with cruelty toward the people struggling in the waves, but with the specific pleasure of safety recognized, of warmth and shelter known to be warmth and shelter through the contrast provided by weather you are not in. Peter Griffin has a version of this every time he sits on his couch and realizes, however dimly, that he is comfortable and that the beer is cold, and that tomorrow doesn't need to arrive for a few more hours. He is on the shore. The world's storm is out there somewhere. He is not in it right now. That recognition, however briefly and however undramatically it occurs to him, is the Epicurean moment. The moment when what you have is enough because you can actually feel that it's enough. Not because you've given up on more. Not because you've decided to be grateful in a performative way. But because in this specific moment, the warmth of the room and the cold of the beer and the face of the friend across from you are real and present and sufficient. Peter Griffin, asleep on his couch with the television still on, is in that moment. The philosophy is quiet. The beer is drunk. The storm is elsewhere. And he is, without making anything of it, completely where he belongs. Section 3. Present tense living the accidental mindfulness of Peter Griffin. There is a practice that has been spreading through Western culture for the past several decades that comes originally from Buddhist and Hindu meditative traditions, was studied and adapted by psychologists at the University of Massachusetts in the 1970s, and which has by now been packaged into apps and corporate wellness programs and best-selling books and weekend retreats in various beautiful and expensive parts of the world. The practice is called mindfulness, and its central instruction, stripped of all the packaging, is almost insultingly simple. Pay attention to what is actually happening right now. That's it. That is the core. Be here, in the present moment, with the things that are actually occurring rather than somewhere else in your mind, reliving the past or pre-living the future. Just be where you are. This sounds easy. It is, in practice, one of the most difficult things that human beings attempt to do. The mind, left to its own devices, does not want to stay in the present tense. It wants to spin backward into memory and forward into anticipation. It wants to rehearse conversations that haven't happened. It wants to relitigate conversations that have. It wants to calculate outcomes and imagine scenarios and construct stories about what is going to happen and what has happened and what it all means. The present moment is, for the untrained or unassisted mind, something that passes through awareness at remarkable speed on its way to becoming the past, which the mind will then revisit and revise for an indeterminate period. Mindfulness practice is essentially the practice of slowing that process down, of learning to rest in the present rather than constantly leaking into the past and future, of finding the specific texture of this breath, this sensation, this sound, this room, this moment, and allowing it to be enough. Peter Griffin has never attended a mindfulness retreat. He has not heard of John Kabat-Zinn, the psychologist who brought Buddhist mindfulness into clinical Western settings. He almost certainly couldn't define the word metacognition. He has probably never sat in meditation, and if he tried, he would fall asleep inside of 4 minutes, which would be, depending on your perspective, either a failure or an extraordinary success. But Peter Griffin lives, almost entirely and almost involuntarily, in the present tense. This is not because he has cultivated presence through practice. It is because he lacks the cognitive apparatus to spend much time anywhere other than the present. The mental architecture that generates chronic rumination, that replays the past in search of different outcomes, that runs elaborate forward simulations of possible futures, that constructs the kind of sustained narrative self-criticism that makes so many people so quietly miserable, that architecture is not something Peter Griffin possesses in any serious degree. He is, in the language of modern psychology, genuinely low in the trait called neuroticism. He does not ruminate. He does not lie awake cataloging his failures. He is not visited by regret in the middle of the night. He makes a disaster, and within a surprisingly short time he is fine. Not because he has processed the disaster and arrived at equanimity through wisdom, but because his mind simply does not stay parked on the disaster. It moves. It finds something else. The present moment offers something new, and Peter turns toward it. This is, from the perspective of someone who suffers from chronic overthinking, mildly miraculous. There is a thought experiment that the philosopher Alan Watts used to describe the problem of living in one's head rather than in one's experience. He talked about mistaking the menu for the meal. The menu is the representation of the food. It describes the food, points toward the food, allows you to navigate the choices that precede the food. But no one eats the menu. The menu is not the thing itself. And yet, Watts argued, most people spend most of their lives eating the menu. They are not in the experience of their lives so much as they are in the mental representation of their lives. They are running the narration rather than living the event. Peter Griffin never eats the menu. He cannot eat the menu because he can barely read the menu. He goes straight for the food. When he is at the drunken clam, he is at the drunken clam. He is not thinking about being at the drunken clam while simultaneously managing his feelings about not being at work or at home or somewhere more impressive. He is just there. The beer is in his hand. His friends are around him. The sound of the bar is what it is. He is inside the experience rather than watching the experience from a remove. This might sound like a low bar for enlightenment, and it is. Peter is not enlightened. But the thing that contemplative traditions point at when they talk about presence, the thing that the Zen teachers are describing when they say that ordinary mind is Buddha mind, the thing that Thich Nhat Hanh means when he writes about washing dishes as an act of complete attention, that thing has to do with the quality of contact between a person and their own life. Whether you are actually touching your life or merely managing it from a distance. And by that measure, Peter's contact with his own life is unusually high. He touches his beer with his whole attention. He watches his television with his whole attention. He argues about nothing with his whole attention. He is not distracted by meta-concerns. He does not stand slightly outside himself, judging the experience, wondering if he should be having a different one. He is in the room, in the moment, in the thing that is actually happening. The Buddhist concept of dukkha, usually translated as suffering but more precisely meaning a kind of pervasive unsatisfactoriness, arises largely from this gap between what is and what we want to be. The gap is maintained by the restless mental commentator that runs inside most human minds, always noting what's missing, always preferring the hypothetical to the actual. The practice of meditation is largely the practice of quieting that commentator, of sitting with what is until the commentator runs out of things to say and you are left with the bare fact of experience, which is usually, in its bare form, quite tolerable, often even peaceful. Peter's commentator is quiet not because he has silenced it through practice, but because it was never very loud to begin with. His mind does not produce much meta-commentary. When things are good, he knows they're good. When things are bad, he reacts to that directly, without a great deal of analysis. The suffering he experiences in the show is almost always immediate and situational. He is in pain right now because the thing that happened right now caused pain. He is happy right now because the thing happening right now is good. The connection between his inner state and his outer circumstances is unusually direct. This directness is, paradoxically, one of the things that makes him so watchable. There is something deeply restful about watching a character who is not caught in the elaborate internal drama that most people experience as the constant background noise of consciousness. You can watch Peter Griffin eating a sandwich and feel something almost like envy, not of the sandwich but of the way he is eating it, with his full face, with his whole body leaning toward it, with absolutely no part of his attention elsewhere. Now, Buddhist teachers would be quick to point out that this is not what they mean by presence, because the kind of presence they describe is achieved through awareness rather than through the absence of reflective capacity. There is a difference between the absence of mind and the stilling of mind, between being unable to think about the future and having made a deliberate choice to rest in the present. The monk sitting zazen and Peter Griffin eating a sandwich may look similar from the outside, but the inside is different. The monk has faced the mind and stilled it. Peter has a mind that doesn't require stilling. And yet, and this is where it gets genuinely interesting, the experiential result shares a family resemblance. In both cases, the moment is what it is. The food is just food. The beer is just beer. The bar is just the bar. Nothing is inflated by fantasy or diminished by comparison with some better version. Nothing is held at arm's length by the fear of losing it later. The experience is had and it is enough. The psychologist Mihai Csikszentmihalyi spent decades studying what he called flow states, states of complete engagement in which self-consciousness drops away and a person is fully absorbed in an activity, experiencing time differently, performing at their best, reporting afterward that the experience felt deeply satisfying in a way that is hard to articulate. He found that flow occurred when a task was challenging enough to require full engagement but not so difficult that it produced anxiety. The sweet spot between boredom and overwhelm. Csikszentmihalyi found flow in athletes and musicians, and surgeons and chess players and factory workers who had learned to bring full attention to their work. He also found it in less obviously skilled activities, when the attention was genuine and the engagement was real. Peter finds something adjacent to flow in watching television. This sounds absurd, and it is a bit absurd. But consider, when Peter is fully engaged with something on the screen, when he is leaning forward on the couch and genuinely absorbed, his self-consciousness drops away. He is not managing his image. He is not thinking about how he appears. He is just watching. The gap between himself and the experience closes. Time passes in the uncounted way that it does when attention is genuine. Csikszentmihalyi also wrote about what he called optimal experience as a function of the clarity of goals and the immediacy of feedback. Peter's goals when he is watching television or drinking beer or talking to his friends are extraordinarily clear. They are also immediately and continuously fulfilled, which means the feedback loop is tight and the satisfaction is real time. He is not watching the game on television while waiting for some more important experience to arrive. This is the experience. It is happening now. It is enough now. There is something in this worth pausing on. The modern world has made a lot of promises about what would make life feel meaningful and full. More stimulation, more productivity, more achievement, more optimization, more of everything. The result, paradoxically, has been widespread reports of feeling empty, distracted, and disconnected from one's own life. People have more access to more things than ever before and feel less satisfied than the surveys from earlier decades suggest they expected to feel. The gap between expectation and experience has widened rather than narrowed. Peter has no gap between expectation and experience, because his expectations are calibrated to his circumstances with extraordinary precision. He does not expect the beer to transform him. He expects it to taste like beer. It tastes like beer. The circle closes. The satisfaction is complete. This is not, to be clear, an argument that Peter Griffin has found the secret to life. He has not. His way of moving through the world comes with catastrophic practical costs that are the entire engine of the show's comedy. His present-tense existence means he learns almost nothing from the past, which means he repeats the same disasters with cheerful regularity. His lack of anticipatory anxiety means he also lacks anticipatory planning, which means that problems he could have prevented arrive as genuine surprises. But the specific question of whether you can be present in your own life, whether you can be actually in the room you're in, actually in the moment you're having, rather than perpetually somewhere else in your mind, Peter Griffin has the answer to that question. And the answer is yes. Emphatically, completely, and apparently without trying. The next time you find yourself lying awake in the dark, your mind rehearsing conversations that haven't happened yet or revisiting ones that happened too long ago to change, consider the specific piece of a large man in a green shirt on a beige couch in Rhode Island, not worrying about yesterday, not anticipating tomorrow, fully occupied by the small and sufficient miracle of right now. Section 4. The Drunken Clam Doctrine on Friendship, Community, and the Philosophy of Belonging. There is a bar on the south side of Quahog, Rhode Island called the Drunken Clam. It is not an impressive bar by any aesthetic measure. The lighting is the dull amber of a place that is not trying to create atmosphere, because atmosphere is not what the regulars come for. The stools are the kind that have been sat on for so long that they have accepted the general shape of the people who have been sitting on them, which is to say they are comfortable in the specific and irreplaceable way that only age and use can produce. There is a jukebox that plays the same songs it has always played. There is a television above the bar that shows sports in the way that television above bars has always shown sports, with the sound either too loud or too quiet, and a smear of old fried food smell in the air that is more comforting than it has any right to be. Peter Griffin comes here almost every evening. He comes here because Quagmire will be here. Quagmire, who has known Peter since what feels like the beginning of their adult lives, whose actual romantic ethics are somewhere south of defensible, and yet whose loyalty to his friends is absolute and long. Glenn Quagmire is the man who will show up. Whatever happened and however the situation arrived, Quagmire will be in the room. He will be in the stool next to Peter's stool, and he will say something inappropriate, and then something true, and the evening will have begun. Joe Swanson will be here. Joe, who is a police officer and a paraplegic and a man of considerable personal courage and only slightly less considerable stubbornness. Joe brings to the Drunken Clam a kind of moral seriousness that sits in interesting tension with the general atmosphere of cheerful irresponsibility. He has opinions about right and wrong that are sometimes correct and sometimes rigidly applied, but they are genuine. He is not performing virtue. He is a man who has decided certain things are true and who lives accordingly, and who brings that decided quality to his stool at the bar as surely as he brings his drink. Cleveland Brown will be here. Cleveland, who has the even keel that the others lack, who processes the chaos of their shared lives with a particular patient humor, whose steadiness is not the steadiness of someone who doesn't feel things, but of someone who has decided that feeling things quietly is more useful than feeling them loudly. Cleveland is the drunken clam's emotional anchor, even when he doesn't know he's playing that role. These four men have been coming to this bar for as long as the show has existed. The specific composition of the group has varied over the years. Cleveland moving to Virginia for a period and returning, various things happening to various people, but the essential structure of the gathering has not changed. Four men, one bar, the same stools. The same basic conversation, which is to say the same essential thing expressed in 1,000 different specific forms. We are here, you are here, I am here, this is where we are. The ancient Greeks had a word for the deep friendship that the drunken clam represents. The word was philia, and it was one of the several words ancient Greek philosophy used to describe different qualities of love and connection. Eros was romantic love. Storge was the love of family. Agape was a broader, more universal love of humanity. And philia was something different from all of those. The love that arises between people who have spent real time together, who have seen each other in circumstances both good and bad, who have accumulated the specific kind of trust that only accumulates through shared experience over time. Aristotle, who thought about philia more carefully than almost anyone before or since, made a distinction between three kinds of friendship. The first kind is based on utility. You are friends with someone because they are useful to you, because they can do things you need done or know people you need to know. This friendship lasts as long as the utility. When the usefulness ends, the friendship typically dissolves, not through betrayal but through simple logic. The reason for being friends no longer exists. The second kind is based on pleasure. You enjoy this person's company, they make you laugh, they know the same music or the same jokes. Being around them is enjoyable. This friendship is warmer than the utility friendship, but it is also, Aristotle argued, still somewhat contingent. Shared tastes change. The pleasure that one person provides can be found elsewhere. These friendships, too, tend to have a limited lifespan, though it is longer and more affectionate than the utility friendship. The third kind of friendship is what Aristotle called perfect friendship. It is the hardest to form and the longest to establish, and it is the kind that endures because it is based not on what you get from the other person, but on who the other person is. You are friends with this person because you love them as a person, because their character is good and you recognize it as good, and that recognition has become a bond. This friendship requires, Aristotle said, that you actually know each other, which takes time. It requires that you want the best for each other rather than simply for yourself. It requires that you have been through things together and that the being through things has not destroyed you. Look at the drunken clam through this framework, and what you see is that Peter, Quagmire, Joe, and Cleveland have, through decades of shared history, arrived at something in the neighborhood of Aristotle's perfect friendship. Not because they are perfect people. They are emphatically imperfect people, each of them flawed in specific and sometimes spectacular ways. But their friendship has survived things that utility friendships and pleasure friendships cannot survive. It has survived conflicts and betrayals, and the specific kind of damage that only people who are very close to each other can inflict. It has survived decades. It has survived Cleveland moving away and coming back. It has survived enormous amounts of stupidity, most of it Peter's. It has survived, and it keeps surviving because its foundation is not what they get from each other, but that they belong to each other. There is a particular scene, and you will know the version of it from whichever season you have watched most, where Peter is in genuine distress and his friends are just there. They are not solving the problem. They are not offering advice. They are sitting in the stools at the drunken clam, and they are there with him, because being there is what they do. And in those moments, the show drops its comedic register for just long enough to let you feel that what this bar represents is not a joke. The drunken clam is what the philosopher Simone Weil called a root. She wrote about rootedness as one of the most important and most neglected needs of the human soul. To be rooted, in her formulation, is to participate genuinely in the life of a community that preserves and transmits certain particular experiences, certain ways of doing things, certain places and habits and gatherings. To be rooted is the opposite of being adrift. It is to know where you belong and to be known there. Peter belongs at the drunken clam. This is not a small thing. Many people spend their entire lives without a place where they belong in this simple and settled sense. They have acquaintances and colleagues and social connections of varying degrees of warmth, but they do not have a place where they are simply known, where they can walk in the door and be seen without explanation, where the specific fact of their presence is welcomed rather than evaluated. The philosopher Charles Taylor has written about how modernity has created what he calls a crisis of authenticity, a widespread sense of disconnection from community and tradition and place that leaves people feeling that they are constructing their identity in a vacuum rather than discovering it in relationship. Modern people are free from many of the constraints that bound earlier communities. They are free to choose their religion, their location, their profession, their identity, but freedom from community and tradition also means freedom from the sense of being embedded, of mattering to a particular place and particular people in a way that doesn't require constant justification. Peter has no such crisis. He is not constructing himself in a vacuum. He is known by these three men in a way that is complete and unconditional. They know his flaws with a specificity that is sometimes alarming. They have watched him fail in ways that would make most people reassess the friendship. They are still there, in the stools, every evening, which means the knowing has not produced rejection. The acceptance is real, and that real acceptance is, for Peter, the foundation upon which his cheerful and uncomplicated existence largely rests. The philosopher Alain de Botton, writing about the social needs of human beings, described friendship as the rehearsal of belonging. Through repeated encounters with the same people, we practice the basic skill of being with another person and having that be enough. We don't need something dramatic to happen. We don't need the evening to be memorable. We need to be in the room with someone who doesn't require you to perform and who doesn't perform for you. Just being there together is the thing. The Drunken Clam is where Peter rehearses belonging. Every evening, the same stools, the same people, the same beer. The practice is the same and the comfort is the same, and neither diminishes with repetition. The 101st evening at the Drunken Clam is as good as the first, or better, because the specific comfort of a place you know and people you know in a way that runs decades deep is a comfort that accumulates rather than erodes. There is also something important in the specific location of the friendship, which is a bar. Not a living room, not an office, not a church hall. A bar. A third place. In the language of sociology. The sociologist Ray Oldenburg wrote about third places in his 1989 book, The Great Good Place, arguing that human communities need three kinds of space. The home, which is the first place of private life. The workplace, which is the second place of productive life. And the third place, which is the neutral, accessible, informal gathering space where community actually happens. Oldenburg argued that the decline of third places in American life, the decline of the local bar, the corner cafe, the barber shop, the town square, was one of the most significant and least discussed causes of social fragmentation in modern America. The Drunken Clam is a perfect third place. It is not anyone's home. It is not anyone's workplace. It belongs, in a sense, to the community of regulars who have made it theirs through the repetition of showing up. It has no formal membership. It requires no registration. The barrier to entry is simply showing up, and the warmth it offers is simply the warmth of being in a place where people know your name and your drink and your complaints and your enthusiasms, where you do not have to explain yourself from the beginning every time. Peter has this. He has it without thinking about it, which is perhaps why he has it so completely. He did not decide to cultivate a deep friendship group with a reliable third place as its anchor. He just went to the bar and kept going, and the years accumulated around the going, and what was once a habit became a structure, and what became a structure became the firmest ground in his life. Epicurus, back in his garden in Athens, also understood the importance of community as the foundation of the good life. He wrote that friendship is one of the most necessary possessions of the wise man, not a luxury or an addition to the good life, but one of its prerequisites. He gathered his students not into a lecture hall, but into a shared living space, because he believed that philosophy was best practiced in genuine proximity, in the daily encounter with other people who were also trying to figure out how to live. The garden was not just a school, it was a community. It was a third place. And this is something Peter Griffin has stumbled into in his own way. The Drunken Clam is his garden. The philosophy that gets practiced there is not formal or articulate, but it is real. Four men, in the reliable repetition of showing up, are practicing the oldest and most durable form of human wisdom available. You show up for the people you love. You keep showing up. The showing up is the philosophy. Section 5. The theology of not caring Peter and the radical freedom of low ambition. There is a word in the English language that functions almost entirely as an uncomplicated complement, and the word is ambitious. We call people ambitious as a form of praise. We tell young people to be ambitious. Obituaries speak of ambition as a virtue. We use the word to mean something like taking one's potential seriously, which implies its opposite. The failure to take one's potential seriously is a moral problem. The non-ambitious person is, in the standard cultural script, someone who has failed to do their duty to themselves. Peter Griffin is the least ambitious major character in the history of American animated television. This is worth sitting with, because the comedic premise of the show handles Peter's lack of ambition as one of many things that are funny about him. It belongs to the general category of Peter's deficiencies. He is not smart, he is not disciplined, he is not ambitious, he is not responsible. These are presented as the terms of the character, the setup for the joke. But if you step outside the joke for a moment and look at what low ambition actually does to Peter's life, what it spares him and what it costs him and what its philosophical implications are, something more interesting than a character deficiency begins to emerge. Peter works, when we first meet him, at Happy-Go-Lucky Toys, and then at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, and across the seasons in various capacities. He is not trying to rise. He is not performing for his boss with an eye toward promotion. He is not building a LinkedIn profile. He is not networking. He is not reading books about productivity or getting up early to optimize his morning routine. He goes to work, he does what is asked of him in his way, and he comes home. The work is not the point of his life. It is the frame that gives the rest of his life structure. This is, in the context of contemporary American culture, a mildly radical position. The culture has made work into the primary site of identity construction. What do you do? Asked of a stranger, means what work do you do, which means who are you? The self is located primarily in the professional project. The professional project is given meaning by its ambitions. The higher the ambitions, the more meaningful the life, or so the story goes. Peter has not received this story, or has received it and has not been persuaded by it, or has been presented with it and has simply failed to retain it. Either way, he does not locate his identity in his work. He locates it in his couch, his bar, his wife, his friends, his beer, his television. The work is what makes the rest of it possible, a position that is philosophically respectable in several traditions and which most working people, given a moment of honesty, would probably agree with. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus, who was himself a former slave and who had more reason than most to have developed an elaborate relationship with the gap between what he could control and what he could not, wrote about the importance of distinguishing between things that are up to us and things that are not. The things that are up to us, he argued, are limited to our own judgments, our own desires, our own attitudes. Everything outside of that, including career outcomes, reputation, social status, the opinion of others, is not up to us in any fundamental way. We can influence these things, but we cannot control them. And attaching our happiness to things we cannot control is, Epictetus argued, the single most reliable way to make ourselves miserable. Peter has not read Epictetus, but his relationship with career outcomes and social status is precisely what Epictetus prescribed. He doesn't care about them, not as a philosophical position he has arrived at through reasoning, but as a basic feature of his personality. His job is what it is. His status in the community of Quahog is what it is. His income is what it is. He does not lie awake at night constructing strategies for improving any of these things. He is not tormented by a vision of a more successful Peter Griffin that the actual Peter Griffin is failing to become. This is philosophically interesting because ambition, in its most common form, requires the construction of a future self that is better than the present self, and then the commitment of substantial present moment energy and peace to the project of becoming that future self. The future self is the one who has achieved the thing, who has arrived, who has made good on the potential. And the present self is always, in this framework, falling short of that future self. The present self is the project rather than the destination. Peter has no future self project. He is not working toward a version of himself that has done something important. He is, in a phrase that sounds trivial and isn't, himself right now. And the right now is the whole story. There is no ambition future that the present Peter is failing to become. The philosopher Harry Frankfurt, in a famous essay called The Importance of What We Care About, argued that what distinguishes a meaningful life from an empty one is not the achievement of any particular goal, but the orientation of care. We live with meaning to the extent that we genuinely care about things, not as instruments to something else, but as ends in themselves. The caring is the thing that organizes and animates the self. Peter cares. He cares about his beer and his friends and his wife and his children and his television and his dignity in his way. He cares about the patriots. He cares about the drunken clam. These are not instrumental cares. He is not drinking beer because beer will lead to something else. He is drinking beer because beer is what he cares about right now, and the caring is genuine and direct. By Frankfurt's measure, Peter's life is full of genuine care, which means it is a life organized around things that matter to the person living it. The question of whether those things are the right things to care about is a separate question, and one that Peter is not troubled by. He has not been seized by the anxiety of meaning that afflicts so many modern people, the worry that the things they are spending their time on are not important enough, not worthy of a life, not the things they would choose if they were really being honest about what matters. Peter is not lying awake, asking whether beer and television and the drunken clam are worthy of a life. They are what he has and what he wants, and the circle closes. The Taoist tradition, which is one of the great philosophical systems devoted to the art of not forcing things, has a concept called Wu Wei, which means something like non-doing or effortless action. The Tao Te Ching, attributed to Laozi, describes Wu Wei as a mode of being in which you act in harmony with the natural flow of things rather than against it, in which you do not impose your will on circumstances but rather move with circumstances, like water finding the low places. This is usually described in poetic and slightly mystical terms, but at its practical core it has to do with the relationship between effort and ambition. The person practicing Wu Wei is not grinding against the world's resistance. They are not forcing outcomes. They are not constructing elaborate strategies for achieving goals that the world has not offered them yet. They are finding the natural path through the circumstances they are actually in, and following it, and finding that following it is easier and more sustainable than the grinding alternative. Peter Griffin is a practitioner of accidental Wu Wei. He does not push against the current of his circumstances. When his circumstances are good, he floats. When they are bad, he reacts immediately, dramatically, and usually in ways that make them worse. But then the dramatic reaction subsides and he returns to floating. He does not maintain sustained campaigns against the world. He does not sustain resentments for long. He does not carry the weight of his ambitions because he does not have many ambitions to carry. There is a school of thought in positive psychology that has produced considerable research on what is called hedonic adaptation, the tendency for human beings to return to a baseline level of happiness regardless of what happens to them. People who win the lottery and people who become paraplegic both, on average, return to roughly their pre-event happiness level within about 2 years. The peak of the lottery win and the trough of the accident both fade, and the person is more or less where they started. This finding is usually presented as somewhat sobering, a caution against expecting that good fortune will permanently improve your life. But it also has a more optimistic implication. Most of what we pursue with such energy and commitment, the promotions and the houses and the status upgrades, will not, in the end, significantly alter our baseline happiness. The baseline is the thing, and the baseline is largely determined not by circumstances, but by temperament and relationship and the quality of one's daily life at the granular level. Peter's baseline happiness is high. This is a fact about him that is established early in the show and maintained across decades. He is not a man straining against a low baseline, trying to push his happiness above its natural resting point through achievement. He is a man whose natural resting point is already quite high, whose baseline is closer to contentment than to misery, and who therefore has less need of the machinery of ambition to feel that his life is worthwhile. Low ambition, for Peter, is not a failure. It is a form of accurate self-knowledge. He knows, without knowing that he knows it, that the things he actually needs to be happy are already available to him. The things that ambition would deliver, status and wealth, and the esteem of people he doesn't particularly know, these are not on his actual need list. They are on someone else's list. He has accidentally avoided the confusion of that other list with his own. Section 6. The Married Man's Philosophy. Peter and Lois. Love despite everything. Begin with the simplest possible version of this story. A man and a woman have been married for a long time. The man is not the husband she would have designed from first principles. He is not what her wealthy, patrician parents hoped for her. He is not particularly handsome, not particularly reliable, not particularly sophisticated. He is large and loud and frequently wrong and sometimes genuinely dangerous to be around if you are invested in things going correctly. He loses money. He damages property. He invites chaos into the house as a matter of course, not through malice but through the specific combination of limited foresight and unlimited confidence that defines his approach to every situation. The woman is Lois Griffin, née Peter Schmidt, and she is, by every conventional measure, the more impressive of the two. She is intelligent and patient and capable of managing a household that is constantly in some degree of low-level emergency. She has a sense of humor about her husband that is dry and warm in equal measure. She has, underneath her generally composed surface, a wildness of her own that the show takes care to reveal in specific and telling moments. She is not the standard put-upon animated wife, or at least not entirely that. She has depths. She has also, despite everything, stayed. Not just stayed in the sense of not leaving, though she has had occasion to leave many times and has not. Stayed in the deeper sense of still being in the marriage, still engaged with it, still finding something in this relationship that matters to her in a way she cannot easily replace. She married Peter Griffin knowing approximately what she was getting. Her parents tried to warn her. The evidence has continued to accumulate over decades. She is still in the house at 31 Spooner Street, still making dinner, still navigating whatever latest catastrophe has arrived, still turning toward Peter in the moments when the catastrophe has subsided and finding him there. This is a philosophical text about Peter's accidental wisdom, but the marriage is where Peter's accidental wisdom and accidental chaos intersect in the most complex and most interesting way. Because the marriage is not simple. It is not a joke. It is two people who have chosen each other in a way that keeps being renewed, imperfectly and repeatedly, across an enormous span of shared time. The philosopher Alain de Botton, who has written thoughtfully and sometimes provocatively about love and relationships, argues that the romantic ideal of love, the idea that love is the experience of finding someone who perfectly completes you, who understands you without explanation, who shares all your aesthetics and all your deepest values, and with whom life is effortless, is not just unrealistic but actively damaging. It sets an impossible standard against which real relationships, with their compromises and irritations and misunderstandings and everyday flatness, can only disappoint. De Botton proposes instead what he calls a more mature, pessimistic philosophy of love. Not pessimistic in the sense of hopeless, but pessimistic in the sense of realistic, beginning from the premise that everyone you could love is, in ways both large and small, the wrong person. That love is not the discovery of the right person, but the project of learning to be with an imperfect person in a way that is sustaining and real. That the difficulties of a long relationship are not signs of failure, but evidence of something genuinely rare. Two people who have not run away when running away would have been easy. Peter and Lois have not run away from each other. They have run away from individual situations, and they have experienced individual crises, and there have been moments when the marriage has been placed under strain that would destroy less resilient structures. But the structure has held. And the reason it has held is something worth examining, because it is not what the romantic ideal says it should be. It is not because they are perfectly suited. They are not. Lois reads books. Peter does not. Lois appreciates art. Peter does not understand it. Lois has social intelligence that reads rooms and manages relationships with a skill that Peter lacks entirely. Peter has a physical confidence and an unguarded emotional expressiveness that Lois sometimes envies and sometimes is appalled by and sometimes finds, in specific moments, completely charming. It holds because of something that looks, from the outside, less glamorous than romantic love but which is, in practice, more durable. It holds because of what the philosopher Harry Frankfurt called wholeheartedness, the quality of caring about something fully and without reservation, without the hedging that comes from maintaining the option to care differently later. Lois is wholehearted about her family. Peter, underneath everything, is wholehearted about Lois. Not consistently, not without failure. But at the level of deep structural orientation, Peter Griffin is pointed toward his wife, and she knows it, and it matters. There is a moment that recurs across many episodes in different forms. Peter has done something catastrophic. The house is damaged, or the money is gone, or the community is outraged, or some specific relationship has been tested beyond what seemed testable. And eventually, after the chaos has subsided and the immediate consequences have been dealt with or simply absorbed, Peter and Lois are in the same room together, and there is a conversation, and it is sometimes a real conversation, and at the end of it, they are still together and still recognizably themselves. This ending is not triumphant. It is not the Hollywood landing where all the problems are solved and everyone has learned their lesson. It is just two people who have once again come through something together and who will, because they are who they are, do it again. The repetition is not failure. The repetition is the texture of a long marriage, which is not a single sustained achievement, but a continuous process of repair. The philosopher John Gottman, who has spent decades studying couples and trying to identify what makes relationships last, found that the single most predictive variable of relationship stability is not the absence of conflict, but the ratio of positive to negative interactions during conflict. Couples who stayed together, he found, maintained a roughly 5-to-1 ratio of positive to negative exchanges even during disagreements. The negativity was present, the friction was real, but it was consistently outweighed by gestures of warmth, humor, respect, and genuine turning toward each other. Peter and Lois fight, loudly, sometimes dramatically, with the specific vocabulary of people who know each other's vulnerabilities with precision, but in the accumulation of their interactions, across the full texture of a shared life, there is more warmth than cold. Peter is, under the right circumstances, genuinely affectionate. He tells Lois she is beautiful. He is proud of her in ways that are unguarded and real. He finds her funny. He is, when the chaos clears, simply glad that she is there. And Lois finds, in specific moments, the specific thing about Peter that made her choose him in the first place. Not his sophistication, which he lacks. Not his reliability, which is intermittent at best. But something else. A quality that is harder to name and more durable than the things that make a person impressive on paper. An absence of pretension, a complete inability to perform himself, a genuine enthusiasm for the small pleasures that the life they built together makes available. The philosopher Iris Murdoch wrote about love as the process of learning to see another person, not the idea of them or the projection of what you want them to be, but the actual person in their actual particularity. She called this process attention, and she thought it was one of the most difficult and most important things a person could do. To truly attend to another human being, to suspend your own ego's demand that the other person be what you need them to be, and instead to simply see them as they are, was, she argued, both the practice and the product of love. Lois has learned to see Peter. This is not a small thing. Peter is not easy to see clearly, because his particular combination of qualities, the genuine warmth alongside the spectacular obliviousness, the deep loyalty alongside the consistent failure to exercise judgment, requires a very particular kind of attention to hold simultaneously. She has learned to hold it. She sees him, and Peter, in his way, sees Lois. Not with the analytical clarity that she brings to most things, but with the unfailing recognition that she is the person at the center of his life, that the house means what it means because she is in it, that coming home is coming home because she is there. He does not have the vocabulary for this. He does not deliver speeches about it. But it shows up, in the moments when the comedy steps aside, as something real. This is, in the end, what a long marriage is. Not the fulfillment of the romantic ideal, but something stranger and more interesting. Two people who have chosen to remain visible to each other across decades, through the accumulation of ordinary days and the occasional extraordinary catastrophe, finding in the repetition of that choosing something that sustains them both. Section 7. The Chaos Agent, Peter as trickster, catalyst, and the Jungian shadow. Every mythology has a figure who doesn't fit. Every cosmology, every pantheon, every story tradition that has ever tried to map the full range of human experience into a cast of characters has eventually had to make room for the one who breaks things. The one who arrives with no respect for the established order, who overturns the table not out of cruelty but out of some essential nature that cannot be contained by the rules everyone else agreed to follow. In Norse mythology, this figure is Loki. In Native American traditions, it is Coyote. In West African and African American folklore, it is Anansi the spider. In Greek mythology, it is Hermes, the divine trickster who moves between worlds and owes allegiance to none of them. In the Arthurian cycle, it is something like the Fool, the court jester who says the true thing while everyone else is performing the expected thing. Carl Jung called this figure the trickster archetype, and he argued that it appears in every culture and every mythological system because it corresponds to something real in the human psyche, a force that is neither purely creative nor purely destructive, but which is both at once, in a proportion that shifts with every appearance. The trickster creates through destruction. It disrupts the established order in ways that sometimes cause genuine harm, and sometimes, in the wreckage of the disruption, reveals something that the established order was hiding. The trickster is not wise in the way that the sage is wise. It does not plan, it does not calculate. It simply acts, and the action is always excessive, always slightly beyond what the situation called for, always productive of consequences that nobody, including the trickster itself, fully anticipated. Peter Griffin is, in his way, one of the most complete trickster figures in the history of American popular culture. This sounds like a large claim to make about an animated man who once got into a protracted physical feud with a giant chicken, and I want to be careful about what I'm actually saying. I'm not saying Peter is mythologically sophisticated. I'm not saying he is consciously playing a cosmic role. I'm saying that the function he performs within the social ecology of the show and within the narrative structure of the story maps onto the trickster archetype in ways that illuminate why the character is so enduring and why the chaos he generates is not merely comic but carries a genuine weight. The trickster archetype, as Jung described it, functions as the shadow side of the hero. Where the hero is controlled and purposeful and socially integrated, the trickster is impulsive and purposeless and socially disruptive. Where the hero builds and protects, the trickster demolishes and exposes. But here is the key insight that Jung arrived at about the trickster. It is not evil. It does not intend harm. It simply has a nature that is incompatible with the stable functioning of the established social order, and the collision between that nature and the social order is where something important gets revealed. What gets revealed, in mythological terms, is the rigidity of the social order itself, the rules that look like natural laws until the trickster breaks them and nothing catastrophic happens to the universe, which reveals that they were conventions all along. The hierarchies that look inevitable until the trickster treats everyone in them as equally worthy of mockery, which reveals that the hierarchy was maintained by performance more than by any inherent structure. The pretensions that look like realities until the trickster's genuine inability to understand them exposes them as pretensions. Peter does this constantly. He walks into social situations that have an established script, a set of implied rules about how everyone is supposed to behave, what they are supposed to say, what they are permitted to want, and he deviates from the script not because he is rebelling but because he literally does not know the script exists. He says the thing that everyone else is thinking but has decided not to say. He wants the thing that everyone else has agreed to pretend they don't want. He does the thing that everyone has agreed is not done, and then stands in the wreckage looking genuinely puzzled about why everything is different now. There is an episode in which Peter wanders into an upper-class social event that Lois's parents are hosting, an event saturated with the specific kind of old money propriety that requires everyone to perform a version of themselves that is more contained, more careful, more invested in the appearance of refinement than in any actual experience of pleasure. And Peter is simply not doing that. Peter is eating too much of the food too fast. Peter is talking too loudly about things that are not appropriate topics for this register of conversation. Peter is enjoying himself with an unself-consciousness that the other guests, precisely because they are so self-conscious, find both offensive and, in their more honest moments, quietly enviable. The function Peter is performing in these scenes is the trickster's function. He is making the social performance visible by refusing to perform. He is showing, through his very presence, that the refinement everyone is maintaining is a choice rather than a natural condition. He is the figure who reveals, simply by being what he is, what everyone else is working so hard not to be. The psychologist James Hollis who writes about Jungian archetypes in the context of modern life, has written that the trickster appears in our lives, both in stories and in actual people, as a kind of invitation to look at what we have left out. The trickster arrives with what has been excluded: the body, the appetite, the laughter, the inappropriate truth, and it insists on its inclusion whether or not we want it included. The trickster is the return of the repressed, in a Freudian sense as well as a Jungian one. It carries what the social order has decided to leave outside. What Peter carries, persistently and without apology, is appetite. Not just appetite for food, though food is certainly in there, but appetite in the broader sense, the unguarded wanting of things, the refusal to pre-apologize for one's desires, the insistence on enjoying what is enjoyable without framing that enjoyment in the language of guilt or moderation or self-improvement. He wants the beer, he wants the television, he wants the sandwich, he wants the afternoon off, he wants to do the stupid thing that sounds fun. He doesn't dress these wants in the language of aspiration or justify them in the language of self-care. He just wants them and pursues them, and when he gets them, he is satisfied in the way that only genuinely undisguised appetite can be satisfied. In a culture that has become expert at telling people that their appetites are problems to be managed, that wanting things is a symptom of something that needs to be addressed, that the unexamined desire for simple pleasure is a personal failing, Peter Griffin's unguarded appetite is a kind of revolutionary act, not because he intends it to be revolutionary, but because the revolution of the trickster is never intended. It is just what happens when an uncontainable nature meets a container. The chaos Peter generates is not malicious. This is one of the things that makes him a genuine trickster rather than simply a villain or an antagonist. He does not sit down and plan to cause harm. He sits down and plans to have a good time, and the good time generates consequences he did not anticipate and usually cannot understand. The harm is a byproduct of nature rather than a product of intention, and this, paradoxically, makes the chaos harder to be angry about. You cannot hate the wind for knocking over your fence. You can be frustrated by it, you can rebuild the fence, but the wind was being wind, and that is all. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, whose relationship with conventional morality was itself somewhat trickster-adjacent, wrote about the figure he called the Dionysian man, the person whose nature is excessive and creative in a way that overflows the Apollonian structures of order and reason. Nietzsche was not celebrating destruction for its own sake. He was pointing at a kind of energy that he thought the modern world had tried to domesticate at the cost of something vital. The Apollonian world, the world of reason and structure and beautiful form, needed the Dionysian energy to stay alive. Without it, the forms calcified. The structures became ends in themselves rather than containers for something living. Peter Griffin is Dionysian in this sense. He is the energy that keeps the structure of the Griffin household from becoming a container for nothing. Without his chaos, the house would be orderly and without drama and considerably less interesting. The chaos is costly. It is genuinely costly, but it is also genuinely animating. The Griffin household, precisely because Peter is in it, is a place where things happen, where life in its most excessive and unmanageable form keeps arriving, where nobody can ever entirely relax into the comfort of certainty about what tomorrow will bring. There is something almost paradoxically generative about this. Lois is a better problem solver than she would otherwise be because she has had to become one. Chris and Meg have been thrown into situations that require navigation of a kind that their peers have not had to attempt. The neighborhood of Quahog is more varied and more interesting, in however disastrous a way, than it would be in Peter's absence. The chaos that Peter generates is the chaos that the trickster has always generated, the force that keeps the story moving, that keeps the system from settling into the dead calm of perfect stasis. The fool in Shakespeare's King Lear tells the king truths that no other character will say. He says them in the register of jokes and riddles, which gives both him and Lear the deniability of comedy. But the truths are real. The fool sees what the king cannot see because the king is too invested in being the king. The fool has no such investment. He has nothing to lose and nothing to protect, and so he can say the thing. Peter sometimes, in his blundering and accidental way, says the thing. He wanders into a situation and, precisely because he lacks the social intelligence to understand what he is not supposed to say, says it. The thing that everyone else in the room was carefully avoiding. the thing that would have been impolite to name. Peter names it, usually badly, usually in a way that causes additional problems. But the naming has happened, and the thing that was being avoided has been brought into the air where it can at least be seen. This is the trickster's gift. It is not a comfortable gift. Nobody wants it when it arrives. But in the aftermath, in the reconfiguration that the chaos necessitates, something has changed that needed to change. And the world, however slightly and however reluctantly, is more honest than it was before Peter arrived, with his beer and his complete inability to read the room. Jung believed that the trickster archetype, when it appears in dreams or in stories, is carrying a message about integration, about the parts of the self that have been excluded in the project of becoming socially acceptable, the appetites and the crudeness and the desire for things that polite society has decided are beneath dignity. He thought the appearance of the trickster was an invitation not to become the trickster, but to integrate what the trickster carries, to find room in a more complete self for the things that the trickster embodies, because leaving them outside doesn't make them go away, it just means they arrive uninvited and at the worst possible moment. Peter Griffin arrives uninvited and at the worst possible moment, reliably, across decades. He is the thing we left outside. He is the appetite and the impulse and the unguarded wanting that the project of being a responsible adult has asked us to put somewhere we can't see it. And we watch him because, in the safety of the comedy, we can allow ourselves to acknowledge what he's carrying, not to become him, to know that he exists, to give the part of ourselves that is also occasionally a large man who just wants beer and television and no consequences for a little while, its proper acknowledgement and its brief, safe comedic space. That is what the trickster is for. Section 8. The working class soul, Peter Griffin, as the American everyman. In 1855, a poet in Brooklyn published a collection of poetry that almost nobody bought, that received a handful of reviews ranging from baffled to hostile, and that the poet himself subsidized out of his own pocket because no publisher would take it. The poet's name was Walt Whitman, and the book was called Leaves of Grass, and it announced, in its famous opening line, "I celebrate myself and sing myself." What followed was hundreds of pages of the most expansive and most democratic celebration of ordinary American life that had ever been committed to verse. A sustained argument that the life of the worker, the carpenter and the butcher and the wagon driver and the fisherman was as worthy of poetry as the life of the king, was in fact more worthy because it was more real. Whitman was making a claim about value. He was saying that the person who does the physical work, who builds the things and grows the food and drives the loads and makes the things that get used, was carrying something that the culture of his time consistently undervalued. He was saying that the dignity he saw in ordinary working people was real dignity, not a consolation for the absence of something higher, but the thing itself. Peter Griffin works at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery. He has also, across the show's run, worked in a toy factory, as a fisherman, as a policeman, as various other things that the plot has required. He is a working-class man. He is not aspiring out of his class. He is not performing his class ironically. He is not using his class as a temporary station on the way to something else. He is a blue-collar, beer-drinking, sports-watching, neighborhood-living man, and this is not a problem he is trying to solve. The sociologist Pierre Bourdieu spent much of his career studying class in France and developing a vocabulary for how class operates not just economically, but culturally. He introduced the concept of habitus, by which he meant the deeply internalized set of dispositions, tastes, ways of speaking and moving and relating to the world that people acquire through their social position, and which shapes how they experience and navigate every aspect of life. Habitus is not something you consciously choose. It is the water you swim in, invisible to the swimmer because it is the medium through which everything else is perceived. Peter's habitus is specific and legible. He moves through the world with the specific body of a working-class man who has never been required to hold himself differently for professional reasons. He eats with the appetite of someone who was raised in a family where food was pleasure rather than aesthetic statement. He speaks with the directness of someone who has never been trained in the particular register of professional communication that middle-class jobs require. He dresses for comfort and for the specific social codes of his community, not for the management of impressions across class lines. This habitus is the source of much of the comedy. Peter walking into upper-class situations is funny precisely because his habitus doesn't change to accommodate the environment. He doesn't code switch. He doesn't modify his presentation. He brings his whole quahog self into every room he enters, including rooms where that self is wildly inappropriate, and the collision between his habitus and the expectations of the room is where the laugh lives. But the comedy has a seriousness underneath it. Bourdieu argued that what he called cultural capital, the specific knowledges and tastes and behaviors that are recognized as valuable by dominant social institutions, is distributed unequally along class lines in ways that function very much like economic capital in terms of what it opens and closes. The people who have it move through the world with ease. The people who don't are constantly confronted with environments that are not built for them, that implicitly communicate their exclusion. Peter is excluded from many of the spaces that his wife's background could theoretically give him access to. He is excluded not by law or explicit rule, but by the subtler mechanics of cultural incompatibility. He doesn't know the right things. He doesn't behave in the right ways. He doesn't value the right values. And he doesn't care about this exclusion in the way that the cultural logic of aspiration says he should care. He does not experience his exclusion from upper-class spaces as a deficit he is obligated to address. He experiences it as those places simply not being for him, and he returns to the spaces that are for him without apparent distress. This is, in the American context, a philosophically significant position. The American dream, in its dominant form, is a dream of class mobility. The promise is that if you work hard enough and want it enough, you can move from where you started to somewhere higher. The somewhere higher is vague, but it is always up. The direction of aspiration in American culture is consistently vertical. And the corollary of this is that the choice not to aspire vertically, the choice to be content with the life available at your current class position, is read by the culture as a failure to take the promise seriously, as giving up, as settling. Peter has never accepted this framework, not as a political statement, not as a conscious rejection of the American dream, but as a basic fact about what he wants, which is the life he has, in the town he's in, with the friends he has, and the bar he goes to, and the work that gives his weeks their shape. He is not settling for this life. He is choosing this life, in the sense that he consistently acts in ways that maintain it, rather than in ways that would transform it. The philosopher John Dewey, who thought more carefully about democracy and American life than almost anyone of his era, argued that democracy was not primarily a political system but a way of life, a set of values that, when genuinely practiced, meant that every person's experience of the world had intrinsic value and deserved to be heard and respected. He was making an argument about the equal dignity of all forms of human experience, including the forms that did not produce great achievements or high status. Peter Griffin's life, measured by the standards of achievement culture, is not impressive. He has not built anything that lasts. He has not risen in any hierarchy. He has not accumulated significant wealth or reputation outside his immediate community, but measured by Dewey's democratic standard, his life is full. It is full of genuine relationships and genuine pleasures and genuine participation in a community that knows him. It is a life that is happening at the human scale, at the scale of people you can actually see and touch and share a drink with, rather than at the scale of abstractions like career trajectories and social mobility. There is something in the specific geography of Peter's life that is worth lingering on. He does not commute across the city to an office tower. He does not travel frequently for work. He does not have a professional network in a city 3 states away. His world has a radius. The brewery where he works, the neighborhood where he lives, the bar where he spends his evenings, the church on Sundays, the backyard where things occasionally explode. This is not a small world. It is a concentrated world. A world where the same people appear in multiple contexts, where you encounter the full person rather than just their professional face, where the relationships have the texture of real knowledge rather than the thinness of occasional contact. The political philosopher Michael Sandel, in his book The Tyranny of Merit, argues that one of the most damaging effects of meritocratic ideology, the belief that people end up where they deserve based on their talent and effort, is the contempt it breeds between those who succeed by its metrics and those who don't. The winners become convinced they earned their position, and the losers deserved theirs, which breaks the bonds of solidarity and mutual respect that democratic communities need in order to function. Sandel argues for a recovery of what he calls the ethic of contribution, the idea that work has dignity not because of how much it pays or how high on the hierarchy it sits, but because of its contribution to the common good. Peter contributes. He makes beer. Beer is something his community wants, and he helps make it available. And this is a genuine contribution to the common good in exactly the modest, unflashy, essential way that most contributions to the common good actually look. He is not building rockets or curing diseases, but he is doing work that matters in the way that most of the work that maintains civilization matters, quietly and without recognition, because it is necessary rather than impressive. The American working class has been the subject of enormous amounts of cultural analysis and political rhetoric, usually from people who are not members of it, and the results are often either patronizing or romanticized. Peter Griffin avoids both of those framings because he is not a symbol of anything. He is a person. He is a specific large man with specific tastes and specific relationships and a specific bar, and the show's genius, particularly in its early seasons, was to give that specificity enough room to breathe that it felt real. Whitman wrote, in Song of Myself, "I am large, I contain multitudes." He meant it as a celebration of democratic complexity, the idea that the American self was big enough to hold contradictions, that you did not have to choose between your working body and your thinking mind, between your appetite and your aspiration, between the commonplace and the sublime. Peter Griffin contains multitudes in Whitman's sense. He contains the appetite and the loyalty and the occasional accidental wisdom and the regular spectacular stupidity and the deep love and the infuriating obliviousness, and all of it, adds up to a person who is fully alive in the specific and unglamorous way that most people are actually alive, rather than in the polished and optimized way that culture keeps telling us to aspire to. This is Peter Griffin's contribution to the culture that created him. He is a reminder that the life available at the human scale, the life of the neighborhood and the bar and the job and the family and the same friends across decades, is a full life. Not a lesser version of some better life that ambition would deliver. Not a settling, a life. Section 9. Peter's Paradox when stupidity becomes a kind of wisdom. There is a long tradition in philosophy and literature of taking the figure of the fool seriously. Not because the fool is secretly smart in a disguised way, though sometimes that is part of the story, but because the fool's particular relationship with reality, unmediated by the anxiety of appearances, unburdened by the need to seem impressive, genuinely free from the social calculations that consume the energy of more conventionally sophisticated people, gives the fool access to truths that sophistication tends to obscure. The fool in the tarot is the zero card, the one who stands at the edge of a cliff with a small pack over their shoulder and a look of cheerful unconcern, about to step into what looks like empty air. The conventional reading of this image is recklessness, the idiot walking off the cliff. But the deeper reading is different. The fool is the card of pure potential, of the beginning before the beginning, of the soul that has not yet accumulated the weight of learned limitations. The fool steps off the cliff, not in ignorance of the fall, but in a trust of experience that pre-rational knowledge sometimes carries more accurately than reason. Peter Griffin steps off cliffs, regularly. Sometimes metaphorically and sometimes almost literally. He steps into situations that his limited cognitive apparatus has not correctly evaluated as dangerous. He commits to actions with a confidence that is entirely disproportionate to his track record. He says the thing and does the thing and goes to the place and eats the food and picks the fight with the specific, cheerful confidence of someone who has not yet learned to be afraid of consequences in the way that experience should probably have taught him to be. And things go wrong, consistently and entertainingly wrong. The cliff, it turns out, was actually a cliff. But here is the paradox that I want to sit with for a while. The fear that keeps more careful people from stepping off the cliff doesn't keep them out of all the bad situations. It keeps them out of different bad situations and out of a lot of good ones, and it costs them something that is harder to name than the cliff falls cost Peter. It costs them a kind of directness, a kind of unguarded engagement with experience that the fear of failure tends to foreclose. The philosopher Nassim Nicholas Taleb, in his work on what he calls anti-fragility, makes a distinction between things that break under stress and things that get stronger under stress. Fragile things, like glass, break. Robust things, like rubber, absorb stress without changing. Anti-fragile things, like muscle tissue and immune systems, and certain kinds of problem-solving capability, actually improve through stress. The stress is not just survived, but metabolized into growth. Peter Griffin is anti-fragile in a very specific and limited way. He is anti-fragile because he has almost no fragility about consequences to himself. The thing that makes most people fragile in their decision-making is the fear of failure, which means that the anticipation of the fall is more inhibiting than the fall itself. Peter has almost no anticipatory fear. He does not run the probabilistic simulation of what could go wrong. He just goes, and when things go wrong, he experiences the consequences directly and immediately, and then he moves on. This direct consequence relationship, without the buffer of anticipatory fear, means he is never in the particular hell of anticipatory anxiety, which is often worse than the actual outcome. The dread of the fall is not part of Peter's experience. The fall itself, when it comes, is immediate and unambiguous and quickly processed, and then it is over. The philosopher Albert Camus, in The Myth of Sisyphus, wrote about the absurdity of human existence, the gap between the human desire for meaning and clarity and the universe's indifference to those desires. He describes Sisyphus, condemned to push his boulder up the hill forever only to watch it roll back down, as a figure who could achieve a kind of triumph, not through escaping the absurd task, but through embracing it. One must imagine Sisyphus happy, Camus wrote, meaning that the acceptance of the absurd condition, the refusal to be destroyed by its meaninglessness, was its own form of victory. Peter Griffin is engaged in an essentially Sisyphean project. He makes messes. The messes are cleaned up. He makes more messes. This cycle shows no sign of breaking and will not break, because the mess-making is constitutive of who Peter is rather than an aberration from it. He is Sisyphus. The boulder is his own nature. The hill is every episode. But here is the interesting thing. You can watch Camus' version of Sisyphus and feel the tragedy of it, the eternal futility, the boulder rolling back every time. Or you can watch Peter Griffin and feel something different, not tragedy, not triumph exactly, something more like the equanimity that comes from a genuinely short memory. Peter doesn't know this is the 1,000th time the boulder has rolled back. He experiences each new disaster with something remarkably close to fresh eyes, because his capacity for retrospective despair is very limited. The boulder rolled back. Well, what's next? This is not wisdom in the sense of understanding. It is something that produces a similar result through a completely different mechanism. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius trained himself, through decades of practice and enormous cognitive effort, to face adversity with equanimity. He wrote in the Meditations about the discipline required to maintain a settled mind in the face of setback, about the practice of perspective, about the smallness of individual suffering in the context of cosmic time. This is wisdom arrived at through sustained and effortful reflection. Peter arrives at equanimity through the absence of sustained reflection. He bounces back quickly not because he has achieved philosophical acceptance, but because he hasn't attached enough meaning to the setback for it to stick. The result, in terms of behavior and apparent emotional state, is similar to the Stoic outcome. He is back to normal quickly. He is not carrying the last disaster into the next day. He is present and unweighted by what came before. This is the paradox. The same place, equanimity after adversity, reached by opposite paths. The sage meditates for decades and learns to let go of attachment to outcomes. Peter never picks up the attachment in the first place. Neither is more correct in any philosophical sense. Both work. The sage would smile at Peter, probably, would recognize in the chaotic man's cheerful resilience something that the sage has worked very hard to cultivate, would perhaps see, with the generosity that real wisdom usually brings, that the cosmos has a sense of humor about how it distributes its gifts. The Zen tradition has a concept of what they call beginner's mind, shoshin in Japanese, the attitude of openness and lack of preconception that a beginner brings to learning. Suzuki Roshi, the Zen teacher whose book Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind became one of the most widely read Buddhist texts in the Western world, wrote that in the beginner's mind there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind there are few. The expert's knowledge forecloses possibilities that the beginner's ignorance leaves open. The beginner walks into the room not knowing what can't be done, and so occasionally does it. Peter Griffin has permanent beginner's mind, not because he has cultivated it, because he cannot accumulate enough expertise to lose it. He walks into every situation with the openness of someone who doesn't know how it works, and therefore isn't limited by the conventional understanding of how it works. This produces, regularly and reliably, spectacular failures. But it also produces, occasionally, the specific breakthrough that only ignorance makes possible. The question asked in innocent seriousness that reveals the emperor has no clothes. The solution tried in blundering naivety that the experts missed because they knew too much to try it. There is a concept in psychology called the Dunning-Kruger effect, named after the researchers who identified it, describing the tendency for people with limited knowledge in a domain to overestimate their competence, while people with genuine expertise tend to underestimate theirs. Peter Griffin is a near-perfect illustration of the Dunning-Kruger curve from the left side. He knows very little and is extremely confident. The confidence is not warranted and regularly produces bad outcomes. But here is what the Dunning-Kruger effect description tends to leave out. The confidence of the incompetent, while it produces bad outcomes in the short term, is sometimes what initiates action at all. The person who knows enough to know how hard something is may also know enough to know how likely failure is, and that knowledge can be paralyzing. The person who doesn't know how hard it is tries. The trying often fails. But sometimes, in the trying, something unexpected happens that the more informed person's caution would have prevented. Peter tries. This is one of his most consistent qualities and one of his most undervalued ones. He does not carefully assess the probability of success before committing. He assesses, very briefly, whether the thing sounds good to him, and then he commits entirely. The commitment is real and full and unguarded, and full commitment to a thing, even the wrong thing, even an absurd thing, has its own form of integrity that cautious ambivalence lacks. The philosopher Kierkegaard wrote about what he called the leap of faith, by which he meant not specifically religious faith, but the quality of commitment that goes beyond what reason can fully justify. He thought that the most important choices in life, the choices about what to commit to and how to live, could not be fully rationalized in advance. At some point, you had to act without certainty, had to step into the thing before you knew for sure it was right. The leap. Peter's entire life is a leap. Every episode is a leap. He launches himself into things with a commitment that his circumstances in no way justify, and his capabilities in no way guarantee. He leaps, and he falls, and he gets up, and he leaps again. This is not inspiring in the conventional sense. It is frequently catastrophic. But it has a quality that is hard to fully dismiss, a quality of all-inness, of not holding yourself back from the thing because you're worried about looking foolish if it doesn't work. Peter never worries about looking foolish. This is because he cannot accurately assess how foolish he looks, but also because the self-monitoring that worry about looking foolish requires is not something Peter maintains in the ordinary way. He is not managing his image. He is not constructing a narrative of himself that he needs to protect from the dissonance of failure. He just is who he is, and when he fails, he is still who he is, and the continuity of self across successes and failures is its own form of integrity. The philosopher Paul Ricoeur distinguished between two kinds of personal identity: item identity, the sameness over time, and ipse identity, the self-constancy that comes from keeping one's commitments. Peter's item identity is remarkably stable across decades. He is always recognizably himself, the same man, the same appetites, the same reactions, the same friends, the same beer. The setbacks and the successes wash over the surface without fundamentally altering who he is. There is something almost enviable about that, the self that cannot be destroyed by failure because it was never dependent on success in the first place. Section 10. The Philosophy of Laughter. Why Peter Griffin exists and what he teaches us. We have come a long way together tonight. We started in a living room on Spooner Street with a large man asleep on a beige couch, and we have traveled from there through the gardens of ancient Athens, and the meditative traditions of East Asia, and the democratic poetry of Walt Whitman, and the shadow psychology of Carl Jung, and the existential philosophy of Albert Camus. We have found Epicurus in Peter's relationship with his beer. We have found the Tao in Peter's relationship with ambition. We have found Aristotle in Peter's friendships. We have found the trickster in Peter's relationship with social order. Now, at the end, I want to talk about the thing that all of these lenses have been circling around. The thing that Peter Griffin actually is, stripped of all the philosophical frameworks. The thing that makes a character who is, by every conventional standard, a disaster, into someone that millions of people have watched for decades and will continue to watch for as long as the show exists. That thing is laughter. And laughter, it turns out, is one of the most philosophically interesting things that human beings do. There is a long tradition of philosophical thinking about what comedy is and what it does. Plato, who was famously suspicious of the arts, thought laughter was dangerous because it encouraged a kind of irrationality, a surrender of the reflective capacity to the immediate pleasurable response. He worried about the Homeric gods laughing at themselves, about what model of uncontrolled response that's set for human beings who were supposed to be cultivating reason. Plato's ideal republic had very little room for comedy. Aristotle disagreed, as he often did with Plato. He thought comedy had value precisely because it dealt with what he called the lower types, with flawed and foolish characters, and that watching these characters gave the audience a safe space to acknowledge the foolishness in themselves without being destroyed by the acknowledgement. Comedy, in Aristotle's framework, was a form of catharsis, not the tragic catharsis of pity and fear, but a lighter version, a release through recognition and laughter of the parts of ourselves we usually try to suppress. The philosopher Henri Bergson, in his 1900 essay Laughter, argued that comedy arises specifically from the mechanical encrusted on the living. We laugh, he said, when we see a living being behaving with the rigid predictability of a machine. The slipping on a banana peel laugh is the laugh at a living person who, for a moment, operated mechanically, who didn't do the adaptive, contextually appropriate thing that a fully alive human would do. We laugh because the mechanical has briefly replaced the human, and the replacement is safe enough to be funny rather than tragic. Peter Griffin is the most mechanical character on the show, in Bergson's sense. He runs the same routines with extraordinary reliability. The confidence that outstrips the competence, the disaster that follows, the brief period of consequences, the reset. The next episode, his predictability is profound, and we laugh at it every time, because the predictability is always expressed in a slightly different specific form, which is the specific variant that keeps the old pattern fresh. We know the shape of what's coming. We don't know the specific incident. The surprise within the familiar structure is where the comedy lives. But comedy is more than the mechanics of joke construction. Comedy, at its best, is also a truth-telling device. The philosopher Kierkegaard wrote that irony and humor are the highest modes of existence, short of religious faith, because they are the modes in which contradiction can be held without being resolved, in which the gap between the ideal and the real can be acknowledged without despair. The comic mode, he thought, was a form of honesty about the human condition that earnest seriousness could not achieve. Peter Griffin is a comic mode applied to the human condition, and the human condition he is applied to is specifically American, specifically working class, specifically late 20th and early 21st century. He is a mirror, not a flattering mirror, not a mirror that shows us at our best, a funhouse mirror that exaggerates specific features of the culture until they are large enough to laugh at, which is also, if you are willing to sit with the laughter rather than just write it, large enough to see. The philosopher Simon Critchley, in his book On Humor, argues that comedy is essentially about failure, not failure as defeat, but failure as the gap between the human aspiration to transcendence and the human reality of embodiment, limitation, and mortality. We are creatures who can imagine perfection, but who cannot be perfect. We want to be pure spirits, but we are also bodies that get hungry and tired and make embarrassing noises. We want to be logical, but we are also driven by appetites that logic doesn't fully explain. Comedy is the acknowledgement of this gap, laughing at ourselves for wanting to be something we're not, and finding in that laughter the relief of not having to pretend anymore. Peter Griffin is almost entirely the lower half of that gap. He is almost entirely the body, the appetite, the limitation, the failure to transcend. He is the embarrassing noise. He is the logic-less appetite. He is everything that the aspiration to dignity and sophistication and reason wants to leave behind. And we love him for it, not despite what he is, but because of it, because he is carrying all the things we are trying to be too dignified to carry, and he is carrying them without shame, and when we watch him carry them, we feel the specific relief that Critchley is describing. The relief of recognizing our own limitation in someone else, and finding that the recognition is not catastrophic but funny. The great essayist David Foster Wallace, who was as serious as anyone who ever wrote about American culture in the late 20th century, had a complicated relationship with comedy. He valued it enormously and was deeply skeptical of irony as a default mode, of the kind of comedy that keeps everything at a distance by always already knowing better than whatever it is joking about. He called for a kind of sincerity, a willingness to mean what you say and to be moved by the things that are actually moving, that he felt ironic culture had made difficult and embarrassing to practice. Peter Griffin is sincere. This is one of the things that makes him unusual among fictional characters in an ironic age. He is not joking about wanting beer. He actually wants beer. He is not performing his enthusiasm for the Patriots. The enthusiasm is real. He is not keeping himself at a safe, ironic distance from his own desires and affections. He has them without quotation marks around them. He is moved by the things that move him, fully and without self-consciousness. This sincerity is part of why he is so watchable across such a long run. Irony gets tired. The knowing wink stops being winking and starts being just the face you make all the time. Peter's sincerity, his genuine wanting, and genuine enjoying, and genuine caring does not tire in the same way, because sincerity has an energy that irony, by definition, lacks. He cares, every time. The caring is real. But I want to end this section, and this entire journey, not with a grand philosophical conclusion, but with something smaller and more immediate. Something that has been true of this show since the 31st of January 1999, and which is, I think, the most important philosophical thing that Peter Griffin does. He makes people feel less alone. The experience of watching Peter Griffin and laughing is the experience of recognizing something in him that is also in you. The wanting of simple things, the falling short of your own best intentions, the loyalty to people who probably deserve slightly better, the love of pleasure without the energy to feel guilty about it, the sense of being surrounded by a world that expects things of you that you are not entirely sure you can deliver. The coming home to the same house and the same face and finding, in the repetition, something that holds. Most people watching Peter Griffin are not stupid the way he is stupid. They are not reckless the way he is reckless. They do not pick fights with giant chickens for reasons they cannot fully explain. But they know what it is to want something simple and find it enough. They know what it is to love people who are difficult. They know what it is to be less than they had hoped, and still be okay, still be here, still be on the couch, still be part of a family and a community that continues regardless of whether you are at your best. The philosopher Emmanuel Levinas wrote about what he called the face of the other, the experience of encountering another person as genuinely other, not as a projection or an instrument or a reflection, but as a genuine alterity, a separate and inviolable existence. He thought that this encounter with the face of the other was the foundation of ethics, the thing that called you out of yourself and into relationship. You saw the other person's face and their need and their reality, and this seeing was the beginning of responsibility. There is something in Peter Griffin's face, that specific large animated face with the two small eyes and the wide jaw and the perpetually surprised expression, that does something like this, that asks to be seen, that presents itself as other, as genuinely other, as a real particular existence with its own logic and its own desires and its own specific weight in the world. And in seeing it, in laughing at it, in following it through all its disasters and recoveries and ordinary evenings at the bar, something happens that is not entirely unlike what Levinas was describing. You are called out of yourself and into relationship with something that is not you, but which you recognize. You recognize the appetite, you recognize the loyalty, you recognize the love, you recognize the failure. You recognize, underneath all of it, the basic animal fact of a creature trying to be comfortable and connected and alive in a world that does not make any of those things simple. Peter Griffin is not a philosopher. He is a large, loud, frequently disastrous animated man who lives in Rhode Island and loves his beer and his wife and his friends and his television and his bar. But in that loving, In that specific and unglamorous and completely unironic loving of the life he has been given, he demonstrates something that the greatest philosophers have always been pointing toward. The good life is not somewhere else. It is not waiting on the other side of achievement. It is not contingent on the resolution of all the contradictions. It is available right now, in the specific form of whatever you actually have and whatever you actually love. If you can find the courage, or in Peter's case, the simple lack of imagination, to accept it without reservation, settle into your couch. Feel the warmth of the room around you. Think about the people who know your name and who will be there tomorrow. Think about the simple pleasure that is yours to have tonight, whatever form it takes. Think about Peter Griffin, asleep on his beige couch with the television still on and one arm dangling toward the carpet, completely at peace with the entire weight of his own imperfect, ordinary, genuinely beloved life. He has found rest. Maybe, tonight, you can too. If this video has been good company for your evening, leave a like and subscribe so the next long, slow, thoughtful video finds you when you need it. Sleep well. We'll be here. End of script. Expanded meditations. Deeper dives into the philosophy of Peter Griffin. On the nature of contentment, a further exploration. Let us return to Peter's couch for a moment, because I think there is more to say about what that couch represents. We have talked about Epicurus and his garden, and the katastematic pleasures of stable being, but I want to push further into the specific phenomenology of what it means to be Peter Griffin at rest. The couch is not incidental. The couch is load-bearing. There is a specific kind of furniture in any home that functions not just as an object, but as a place in the fullest sense of the word. A place where the self is permitted to exist in its most unguarded form. Not the dining room table, which has a social function and requires a certain organization of the body. Not the office chair, which is designed for forward-leaning productivity. The couch, specifically Peter's couch, is where the body announces that it has arrived somewhere and can now be itself. The philosopher Gaston Bachelard wrote a book in 1958 called The Poetics of Space, and in it he made an argument about the psychological significance of the places where we feel at home. He was interested in corners and nests and the specific architecture of intimacy, the places where a human being can feel genuinely sheltered. He thought that the home was not just a shelter in the practical sense, but an image of the psyche, that the rooms of a house corresponded to chambers of the inner life, and that the most important room in any house was the one where you could be most completely yourself. For Peter, that room is wherever the couch is. The couch is his corner in Bachelard's sense, the spot in the world where the armoring that consciousness puts on for public life can be removed. You can watch this in Peter's physical relationship with the couch. He doesn't sit on it in the upright way that good posture advice recommends. He settles into it. The word settle is exactly right. He settles the way snow settles on a surface, gradually and completely, taking the shape of what's there rather than maintaining a shape of his own. This settling is a form of trust. Trust in the physical stability of the couch, yes, but also trust in the larger structure of the life around him. He can settle into the couch because, at some level below language, he knows the house is his, and the family is his, and the neighborhood is his, and the bar is his, and tomorrow will be recognizably like today, in the specific ways that matter. The contentment that we see in his sleeping face is not the absence of something. It is the presence of a kind of animal certainty that the basic requirements of its life are met. This animal certainty is rarer than it sounds. A significant proportion of people who have, objectively, everything that basic animal certainty should require live without it. They have the house and the family and the job and the community, and they lie awake at 3 a.m. anyway, running the calculations of risk and insufficiency that the anxiety machine in their heads keeps producing. The machine is very good at finding deficits. It can find a deficit in the most secure situation. It can generate worry out of nothing, sustaining itself on hypothetical future harms and remembered past humiliations. Peter's machine is slow. It runs only on immediate and present tense inputs. Show Peter a present tense problem and the machine activates, loudly and chaotically. Remove the present tense problem and the machine powers down. It does not keep running on its own momentum. It does not manufacture problems when the actual environment has nothing to offer it. When the couch is available and the beer is present and the television is on, The machine finds no problem to process and returns to standby. This is genuinely unusual. And it is the source of the specific quality of peace you can feel in certain Peter Griffin moments. The moments when the comedy steps aside and you just see a man who is, in this particular instant, doing exactly what he wants to be doing and in no danger of the moment being spoiled by the awareness of all the ways it could be better. The Zen teacher, Shunryu Suzuki, in one of his talks, said something that has stuck with practitioners for decades. He said that enlightenment is not something special. Enlightenment is this moment, exactly as it is. Not this moment improved or transformed or finally arrived at after sufficient practice. This moment, the one you're already in, if you can be fully in it. Peter is fully in it, not because he is enlightened, but because the cognitive machinery that removes people from their present moments is quieter in him than in most. And the result, however arrived at, is that he inhabits his life with a completeness that the more complex minds around him often cannot achieve. I want to make a small philosophical detour here into something that seems unrelated but isn't. The mathematician John Nash, whose life became the subject of the film A Beautiful Mind, suffered from schizophrenia that caused him to see patterns and significance everywhere, to construct elaborate theories of conspiracy and meaning from random data. His mind was, in a very specific sense, too active. It generated too much interpretation. It could not rest in the bare fact of experience, but had to impose significance on everything, including things that had no significance. The treatment that helped Nash was not more thinking. It was learning to recognize the difference between the thoughts that corresponded to reality and the thoughts that were the mind generating material on its own. To sit with experience without immediately constructing narratives about it, to let the moment be what it was without immediately assigning it a meaning. Peter, of course, does not have schizophrenia, but the principle scales. The overactive pattern-making mind is a spectrum. Most people's minds generate more narrative and more significance assignment than is strictly necessary or helpful. The meditation traditions describe this as the thinking mind's compulsion to fill silence with commentary, to keep running even when there is nothing that needs running. Learning to sit with the bare experience without the commentary is one of the central skills those traditions teach. Peter has no commentary. When the beer is in his hand and the game is on, there is no mental narrator describing the experience and assessing whether it meets the standards of a well-lived moment. There is just the beer and the game and the body that is having them. The commentary is absent. The experience is direct, and in that directness, something close to what the meditation teachers mean when they say full presence becomes available. The philosopher William James, who was deeply interested in the varieties of religious experience and who wrote some of the most precise phenomenological descriptions of consciousness in the history of Western philosophy, described moments of mystical experience as characterized by a sense of what he called noetic quality, the feeling that genuine knowledge has been received alongside the complete cessation of the ordinary cognitive machinery. The analyzing, comparing, worrying, planning mind goes quiet. What remains is direct and unmediated contact with whatever is. James was describing mystical states, not Peter Griffin watching television. But the quieting of the machinery is a common element. The machinery is, in both cases, not running. The experience is, in both cases, direct. The quality of the resulting state is, in both cases, characterized by something that looks from the outside like peace. This is the deepest philosophical thing I want to say about Peter Griffin's contentment, and I want to say it carefully, because it is easy to either overclaim it or dismiss it. I am not saying Peter Griffin is enlightened. I am not saying he has achieved mystical union with the present moment. I am saying that the structure of his inner life, specifically the low activity of the cognitive machinery that in most people generates the majority of suffering, produces a state that resembles the states that contemplative traditions spend enormous effort trying to cultivate. The resemblance is real. The path by which it was arrived at is very different. But the place that is arrived at shares a family resemblance that is philosophically significant and practically instructive. On Friendship Revisited, the loyalty that doesn't announce itself. I want to return to the drunken clam and add something that the original section didn't quite reach. There is a quality in Peter's friendships that I have been calling loyalty, and which I want to examine more closely, because loyalty is one of those words that gets used a lot and understood imprecisely. Loyalty is not the same as niceness. Peter is not always nice to his friends. He is frequently thoughtless. He sometimes does things to Joe and Quagmire and Cleveland that, taken in isolation, look like betrayals. He says the wrong thing. He acts in self-interest in moments when his friends needed him to act in their interest. He forgets important things. He misses cues. He is not, by any careful measure, a reliably considerate friend. But he shows up. This is the thing. In the moments when showing up matters most, when the situation has become something that requires actual presence rather than just goodwill, Peter shows up. The showing up is not calculated. He doesn't weigh the cost of showing up against his own convenience and make a deliberate, virtuous choice. He shows up because it doesn't occur to him not to. His friends are in trouble and he is going to be where his friends are. The reasoning, if there is any, is that simple. The philosopher Aristotle made the point that genuine virtue, the kind of virtue that has been integrated into character rather than performed as an exercise in willpower, feels natural. The generous person doesn't struggle against their own reluctance to give. They give because giving is what their character inclines toward. The courage that requires enormous effort and self-overcoming is admirable, but the courage that is simply natural to the person, that flows from who they are rather than from their fight against who they are, is the courage that Aristotle considered truly excellent. Peter's loyalty is natural. It is not effortful. It is not the product of moral reasoning. It is just what he does when his friends need him, expressed in his way, which is usually loud and frequently counterproductive, but genuinely aimed at the person in need. There is a concept in psychology called attachment security, the degree to which a person fundamentally believes that the people they are close to will be there when needed. It is formed in childhood through early experiences with caregivers and shapes the template through which all subsequent relationships are experienced. People with secure attachment move through their social world with a baseline confidence in the reliability of connection. People with insecure attachment are always waiting for the connection to break. Peter's friends have, through the accumulated evidence of decades, reason to feel secure in their attachment to him. Not because he is consistent in his behavior, which he is not, but because the underlying orientation, the fundamental pointing toward rather than away, has not changed. He is still there, in the stool. Every evening, whatever happened last week, the consistency is not in the behavior, it is in the presence. And there is something in this that deserves to be called a virtue, even if it is an unconventional virtue expressed in an unconventional way. The loyalty that stays even when it would be easier to drift. The presence that continues even when the friendship has been strained. The return to the same stool on the same evening as a practice of fidelity that doesn't announce itself as fidelity and doesn't expect credit for it. Peter doesn't think of himself as a loyal friend. He doesn't have a narrative about his own loyalty that he protects. He just comes to the bar. And the coming to the bar repeated across decades is the practice by which the loyalty is expressed and the friendship maintained. There is no gesture more significant than this small one, repeated without end. The philosopher Simone Weil, who was deeply attentive to the spiritual dimensions of ordinary life, wrote about what she called waiting on God, a quality of attention that is not seeking anything but is simply present, open, ready to receive. She applied this idea to human relationships as well, the idea that genuine love has in it a quality of patient presence that is not pushing toward any particular outcome but is simply there, attentively, with the beloved. Peter's presence at the Drunken Clam is not spiritual in Weil's sense, but it shares the structure. He is not there to get anything. He is not there as an investment. He is there because being there is what he does, and the being there is the point. The friends who show up every evening without making a big deal of showing up are practicing the most durable form of love available, the love that doesn't perform itself, that doesn't require acknowledgement, that persists in its small repetitions long after the grand gestures have faded from memory. On the body as philosophy, what Peter's physical life teaches us. This is a thread I want to pull, because it connects several of the things we have talked about and points towards something that I think is undervalued in most philosophical discussions of the good life. Peter Griffin is a body, not primarily or exclusively, of course. He is also a mind, however limited, and a social being. and a moral agent of questionable reliability. But he is very visibly and very prominently a body. The show does not let you forget this. His size is a constant visual presence. His appetites are physical. His pleasures are physical. His pain is physical. His comedy is frequently a comedy of the body, of flesh encountering the world with more velocity and less caution than is technically advisable. The philosophical tradition in the West has, with some important exceptions, been somewhat suspicious of the body. The Platonic tradition placed the soul above the body and treated bodily desires as potential distractions from the soul's proper aspiration toward the eternal and the rational. The Cartesian tradition separated the mind from the body and made the mind the primary site of the self, so that I think, therefore I am, rather than I eat, therefore I am, or I feel hunger, therefore I am. The body became, in the dominant Western philosophical framework, something the mind inhabited rather than something the mind was. There have been important counter-traditions. The Stoics paid careful attention to the body's role in the life of the mind. Spinoza argued for the essential unity of mind and body. The phenomenological tradition, especially in the work of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, made the lived body the primary site of all experience, arguing that cognition itself was fundamentally embodied, that we think with and through our bodies rather than in spite of them. Merleau-Ponty's key insight was that the body is not an object that the mind operates. It is the ground of all experience, the perspective from which everything else is seen and felt and known. Before we have concepts, before we have language, before we have the abstract machinery of reason, we have the body's encounter with the world. The hungry body, the tired body, the body that feels the warmth of another body near it, the body that finds pleasure in motion and rest, and the specific qualities of things encountered through the senses. Peter Griffin lives primarily at this level of embodied experience. He is not primarily a thinking creature reasoning his way through the world. He is a feeling, sensing, wanting, enjoying body that encounters the world directly and responds to it directly. His relationship with food is a relationship of the body. His relationship with beer is a relationship of the body. His relationship with the couch is a relationship of the body finding its natural place and settling into it with the satisfaction of a cat finding a warm spot. This is not a deficiency. Merleau-Ponty would have recognized it as a form of being that is actually closer to the fundamental ground of human experience than the rarefied intellectual forms that Western philosophy has traditionally celebrated. The body knows things the mind doesn't know how to articulate. The body has a wisdom of orientation, of comfort and discomfort, of appetite and satiation that precedes and underlies all the abstract reasoning we perform on top of it. Peter's body tells him what it needs, and he gives it what it needs. He is hungry, and he eats. He is tired, and he sleeps. He wants company, and he goes to the bar. He wants physical rest, and he takes the couch. The loop between need and fulfillment is short, and the body's feedback, the feeling of having what you wanted, is received without a complex layer of guilt or self-critique mediating the satisfaction. Most people have learned to put something between the body's signal and the response to it. The body signals hunger and the mind intervenes with a negotiation about calories and timing and whether this is appropriate given the goals of the current program. The body signals tiredness and the mind intervenes with a judgment about whether enough was accomplished today to justify rest. The body signals the desire for pleasure and the mind intervenes with a cost-benefit analysis. The intervention can be useful. It can prevent the satisfaction of short-term wants at the expense of long-term well-being. But it can also, and this is what Peter demonstrates by contrast, become so thick and so automatic that the body's actual signals get lost in the translation. People who cannot be hungry without a complex relationship with the hunger, who cannot be tired without guilt about the tiredness, who cannot want simple pleasure without immediately evaluating whether the pleasure is justified, are living at one remove from their own bodies, in a state of perpetual management of the self that is exhausting in ways that are hard to name because they are constant. Peter lives without this remove. His body's signals are received and acted on without a great deal of intervening machinery, and the result is that his enjoyment of his pleasures is genuine and complete. He is actually tasting the food. He is actually feeling the rest. He is actually experiencing the warmth of the bar. The experience is not filtered and evaluated. It is simply had. This is, in the language of somatic psychology, a quality of embodied presence that practitioners of body-centered therapies work to help people recover. The ability to feel your own sensations without immediately converting them into problems to be solved. The ability to be cold without immediately beginning a project to be warmer. The ability to be hungry and let the hunger be the simple signal it is, rather than the beginning of a complex negotiation with yourself about worth and willpower and the gap between who you are and who you are supposed to be. Peter has this quality because the negotiation machinery is very quiet in him, but the quality itself, the capacity to be simply in the body's experience without constantly evaluating it, is one of the most healing things a human being can practice. Yoga teachers point at it. Somatic therapists work toward it. Mindfulness practice cultivates it. And Peter Griffin, the large animated man with the limited intellectual range and the reliable enthusiasm for beer and television, accidentally embodies it in a way that deserves more philosophical credit than the comedy usually allows. On legacy and time, what lasts? We are nearly at the end now, and I want to touch on something that the show handles without quite articulating. Something that becomes visible only when you look at the long arc of the thing rather than any individual episode. Peter Griffin has been alive, as a character in a story, since 1999. That is over 25 years of episodes, of the same man in the same house with the same family in the same neighborhood drinking the same beer with the same friends at the same bar. This is, in the history of narrative art, a remarkable duration. Characters in novels are usually given a lifespan of a few hundred pages. Characters in films get 2 hours. Characters in ongoing television series get a few seasons if they're lucky. Peter Griffin has had decades. And across those decades, what has accumulated is not achievement. It is not a legacy in the conventional sense. He has not built a business or left a political mark or written a book or done anything that would be listed in a resume or a eulogy in the conventional fashion. What has accumulated is time with the people he loves, time in the neighborhood he lives in, time at the bar, time on the couch, time in the kitchen where Lois is cooking, time at the dining room table where his children are doing whatever they do, time. The philosopher Martin Heidegger, whose dense and difficult work is not everyone's idea of a good time but which contains some genuinely important insights, argued that human existence is fundamentally temporal. We are beings who know we are going to die, and this knowledge structures everything about how we experience time. We are always in the middle of a life that is heading toward an end, and the question of how to live well is inseparable from the question of how to live in the face of that end. Heidegger thought that most people spent most of their lives in what he called das Man, the they-self, the inauthentic mode of existing according to what everyone else does and thinks and expects, rather than taking responsibility for one's own existence in the face of its finitude. Authentic existence, in his framework, required confronting the fact of death honestly and allowing that confrontation to clarify what actually matters. Peter doesn't confront the fact of death honestly. He doesn't confront most facts honestly, but there is a sense in which his life is already organized around what matters, not through the Heideggerian confrontation with finitude, but through the simple intuition of a man who has always known what he cares about and has spent his time accordingly. The philosopher Seneca, writing in the 1st century AD, produced one of the most concise and most readable philosophical texts on the subject of time. In his essay on the shortness of life, he argued that life is not short, it is simply squandered. The person who wonders where the time went is the person who gave their time to things that were not their own, to the demands of ambition and other people's expectations, and the performance of a life rather than the living of it. The person who has spent their time on what they actually love has lived long, regardless of the number of years. Seneca is writing, of course, for educated Romans with choices about how to spend their time, and he is making an argument against the particular forms of squandering available to them. But the principle, when you look at Peter's accumulated decades of beer and bar and family and television, and the same friends in the same stools, points in an interesting direction. Peter has not squandered his time on things that are not his own. He has not sacrificed his evenings to networking events he doesn't want to attend. He has not given his weekends to the performance of social roles that don't fit him. He has not spent his relationships managing impressions and maintaining strategic positions. He has spent his time on beer and Lois and Joe and Quagmire and Cleveland and his children in their chaotic way and the Patriots and the drunken clam and the couch. These things are his own, completely his own. They are exactly what he would choose if he were choosing consciously, which he mostly isn't, because he never needed to consciously choose things that are simply what he is. By Seneca's measure, Peter Griffin has lived a long life. Not because of the years, though there have been many of them, but because the years have been filled with the things that are genuinely his. The time has been spent on the love and the pleasure and the friendship that make up the texture of a life actually inhabited. This is the final philosophical gift that Peter Griffin offers to anyone willing to look carefully enough. Not a lesson about achievement or sophistication or the cultivation of virtue through systematic effort. A much simpler and much harder lesson. Know what you love it, be there for it. Again and again and again, without making a big thing of it, without requiring it to justify itself, without measuring it against some other version of the love that would be more impressive. Just love what you love. Just be where you are. Just show up, tonight and tomorrow night and the night after that, to the places and the people that are genuinely yours. The rest, as Peter himself might almost say if he were the kind of person to say things like this, has a way of working itself out. One final thought, just before you sleep. The night is late now. Wherever you are, whatever city or country or time zone has you in its quiet hours, the night is doing its work of settling the day, of filling the gaps left by the noise with something softer and darker and more restful. You have spent a considerable stretch of this night with a large, complicated, accidental philosopher from Rhode Island. You have heard about Epicurus and Marcus Aurelius and Aristotle and the Tao and Jung and Bourdieu and Whitman and Merleau-Ponty and Kierkegaard and Camus, all of them making their arguments through the unlikely body of Peter Griffin. I want to leave you with the simplest thing. The thing that all of this has been building toward, underneath the philosophical frameworks and the careful distinctions and the analysis of animated sitcom characters, you are already enough. The life you have, in whatever form it currently takes, with its specific pleasures and its specific people and its specific places, is the life that is available for living right now. Not the version of your life that will arrive after the next thing is achieved or the next problem resolved. The version that exists right now, tonight, in this room. Peter Griffin has been teaching this lesson for 25 years, without knowing he's teaching it, which is possibly the most Peter Griffin thing about the whole project. He didn't set out to be a philosophical exemplar. He set out to find the remote and have a beer. But in the finding of the remote and the having of the beer, night after night, across decades, he has demonstrated something that the greatest minds in the history of human thought have been trying to articulate. The good life is here. It is now. It is this. Sleep well. Further meditations? The last philosophical miles. On repetition and ritual, the deep structure of Peter's days. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard wrote 2 books about repetition, or rather, he wrote one book called Repetition and filled much of his other work with the same question in different forms. The question was this: is it possible to have the same experience twice? And if so, what does that sameness mean? Kierkegaard made a distinction between recollection, which moves backward in time, and repetition, which moves forward. Recollection returns to something that was. Repetition takes something forward into the present and finds it still alive, still generative, still capable of meaning. The person who lives primarily in recollection is nostalgic and static. The person who lives in genuine repetition is engaged in a kind of renewal, finding in the familiar thing not a pale copy of the original, but the original regenerated. This is an abstract distinction, and Kierkegaard was interested in it primarily in the context of religious faith and romantic love. But it has immediate and practical application to the way Peter Griffin lives, and specifically to the way he lives the daily ritual of his evenings. Every evening that Peter goes to the drunken clam is a repetition in Kierkegaard's sense. He is not going back to something that was. He is going forward into something that is renewed and present and alive in the specific form of tonight's version of the thing. The beer tonight is not a pale copy of the beer last night. It is tonight's beer. The conversation tonight is not a memory of the conversation last time. It is tonight's conversation. The friends tonight are not ghosts of the friends from all the previous times. They are Joe and Quagmire and Cleveland, here tonight with whatever tonight has brought them. This is a way of experiencing repetition that requires a certain quality of attention, a willingness to meet the familiar as if it is fresh, because it is fresh even when it is familiar. The same face at the same table is always new because the face is in time, and time never stops moving, and the face you see tonight has in it all the nights that came before, accumulated and present. To see it clearly is to see all of that. Peter sees it in his way. He doesn't analyze it. He doesn't consciously recognize the accumulation. But the warmth he feels at the bar when his friends are around him is the warmth of recognition that goes very deep, the recognition of someone who has been seen and known across a long time and who still finds in the familiar face the full warmth of genuine friendship. The repetition is not diminishing the experience, it is enriching it. Ritual, in the anthropological sense, works through exactly this mechanism. A ritual is meaningful not despite its repetition, but because of it. The repetition is how the meaning is maintained and renewed. The wedding ceremony is powerful not in spite of being scripted, but because of it. The liturgy is powerful not in spite of being the same words every time, but because the sameness is the vessel through which the meaning is carried across time, from person to person, from year to year. The drunken clam is Peter's liturgy. The same stools, the same order, the same rhythm of arrival and settling and the first drink and the first exchange. The ritual of it is the structure through which meaning is maintained. You might think this sounds grandiose for a bar in a fictional Rhode Island town, but the grandeur is in the structure, not in the trappings. Every genuine community has its liturgy. Every deep friendship has its rituals of reaffirmation. The drunken clam is simply more visible and more consistent than most. There is a related concept in the study of human happiness called the hedonic treadmill, which we touched on earlier in a different form. The hedonic treadmill describes the tendency for pleasure to habituate, for the thing that brought joy the first time, to bring diminishing returns with each repetition, until eventually it brings nothing. This is the standard argument against repetition as a source of meaning, and it is the argument that drives the culture of novelty, the assumption that we need new experiences constantly to avoid the deadening of the familiar. But the hedonic treadmill applies primarily to the kind of pleasure that depends on novelty for its effect. A roller coaster gets less thrilling the more times you ride it because thrilling is entirely the product of the unfamiliar drop. But the pleasure of a conversation with an old friend does not habituate in the same way. The pleasure of a cold beer on a warm evening does not become zero with repetition. Some pleasures are renewable rather than exhaustible, and the pleasures of relationship and simple physical comfort are among the most renewable available. Peter has filled his life almost entirely with the renewable pleasures. This is not a conscious strategy, but it means that his daily life, however familiar it becomes, does not empty out. The drunken clam in year 20 of his friendship with Joe and Quagmire and Cleveland is still the drunken clam, still offering the specific pleasure of being known and being together, unreduced by the repetition of having been there thousands of times before. The renewable quality of the pleasure is one of the reasons Peter remains content across decades rather than growing restless for something different. On failure and recovery, the philosophy of bouncing back. Let us be specific about Peter's failures, because the philosophy of Peter Griffin is not complete without reckoning with just how badly and how often things go wrong. He has destroyed property on a scale that, accumulated across all the seasons, would represent a significant insurance liability. He has endangered his family, his neighbors, and on several occasions the broader community of Quahog through actions that ranged from thoughtless to genuinely catastrophic. He has said the wrong thing at a frequency that would have ended most relationships many times over. He has made financial decisions that a financial advisor would describe, in carefully professional language, as concerning. He has on more than one occasion accidentally gotten into geopolitical incidents that by any reasonable standard should have had permanent international consequences. And then, the next episode, he is back. The house is repaired, the relationships are intact, the community continues, the beer is in his hand. This is partly the logic of episodic television, which requires a reset at the end of each story unit so that new stories can begin. But it is also, and I want to argue this seriously, a philosophical position. The philosophical position is that no single failure is definitive. This is a belief that is easy to state and very difficult to actually embody, because our culture has constructed enormous infrastructure for making failures feel permanent. The permanent record, the online memory that forgets nothing, the social evaluation that continuously updates based on the most recent mistake, the internal critic that catalogs every failure and produces them at moments of vulnerability as evidence for the prosecution. Peter does not have this infrastructure internally. When the episode ends and the reset arrives, he moves into it without carrying the full weight of what came before. This is not because he has achieved forgiveness and release through spiritual practice. It is because his memory and his tendency towards self-critique are both limited, but the result is that he gets to begin again. Every episode is, for Peter, a genuine beginning, not burdened by the accumulated shame of all the previous episodes. This is, in the context of how human psychology usually works, an enormous advantage. The research on resilience, the capacity to recover from adversity, consistently identifies the ability to limit rumination as one of the key factors that distinguishes people who bounce back from people who stay down. Rumination, the mental replay of past failures and painful events, extends the suffering of a negative event far beyond the event itself. The event ends and the mind keeps rerunning it, extracting additional suffering from the same material. Peter's mind does not do this. When the disaster is over, it is over. He doesn't replay it. He doesn't extract additional suffering from the memory. He moves forward into the next moment with a cleanliness that is, in a very precise sense, the product of a limited relationship with his own history. The Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron writes about what she calls the wisdom of insecurity, the idea that our attempts to build permanent ground under our lives, to make everything fixed and certain and protected from change and failure, are themselves a source of suffering because the ground is always moving whether we acknowledge it or not. She suggests that learning to be comfortable with groundlessness, with not knowing and not controlling, is actually more stable than the anxious project of trying to make everything certain. Peter lives in something like permanent groundlessness, not as a spiritual achievement but as a basic condition of his life. Things are reliably uncertain around him because he reliably makes them uncertain. He has no ground in the sense of stable, controllable circumstances, but he has ground in a different sense. The ground of the relationships that keep being there, the ground of the bar that keeps being open, the ground of the house that keeps getting repaired, the ground of Lois who keeps staying. This ground is made of people and love and the small, repetitive rituals of ordinary life, and it is, paradoxically, more stable than any circumstantial security could be because it is based on things that choose to remain rather than things that are forced to. The Stoic emperor Marcus Aurelius, who had actual imperial power and therefore actual ground to stand on in the conventional sense, spent years in his private journals training himself to accept the fundamental impermanence of all that power. He kept returning, in the meditations, to the theme of loss. Everything passes. The empire, the reputation, the body, the moment, all of it moves through and is gone. The only constant is change. And in the face of that constant, the wise person finds not despair but a kind of spaciousness, a freedom from attachment that makes every good thing a gift rather than a possession. Peter hasn't read the Meditations, but his relationship with permanence is instructive in a similar way. He doesn't try to hold on to the good moments. He doesn't mourn their passing in the way that people with deeper memory do. The good moment happens and it is complete, and it passes and the next moment arrives. The impermanence that Marcus Aurelius was trying to accept through decades of philosophical discipline is simply the water Peter swims in, invisible and unchosen, and therefore also unresisted. And there is, in that unresisted impermanence, a kind of peace. The peace of the person who is not white-knuckling their way through life, trying to keep everything exactly as it is. The peace of the creature whose grip on things is naturally light, who touches the moment fully, but does not try to keep it past its time. The final catalog. What Peter Griffin knows, without knowing he knows it. Before we close this entirely, I want to make a simple list, not a philosophical argument, not an extended analysis, just a catalog of the things Peter Griffin knows, without knowing he knows them, the implicit wisdom of an accidental philosopher across 25 years on the couch. He knows that the company of people you have chosen, gathered in a warm room with something cold to drink, is one of the highest available goods. He knows this not as a proposition, but as a fact, embodied in the way he walks into the drunken clam and settles into his stool and turns toward his friends. He knows that the body's pleasures, when received simply and without excessive complication, are genuinely good. A sandwich is a good, beer is a good, sleep on a comfortable couch is a good. These goods are not lesser goods because they are modest. They are the goods most reliably and most completely available. He knows that the love of a person who has stayed, who has seen all of it and stayed anyway, is a treasure of incomparable value. He does not have the words for what Lois's staying means. But you can see that he knows it, in the specific way he turns toward her in the quiet moments, in the unguarded affection that sometimes surfaces through the comedy. He knows that a place can be yours in a way that fills something in the self that is otherwise empty. That Quahog, for all its fictional absurdity, is his town, and that belonging to a place matters in ways that mobility culture consistently undervalues. He knows that the showing up is the philosophy. That presence, repeated and consistent and unspectacular, is the practice through which everything that matters in a life gets built. He shows up to the bar. He shows up to the family dinner. He shows up to the neighborhood, in his way, which is chaotic and sometimes catastrophic, but which is showing up nonetheless. He knows that the moment you are in is the moment you have. Not the moment you will have when things are better. Not the moment you had when things were good. The moment happening right now, with all its specific texture and its specific people and its specific modest gifts, is the moment available for living. He lives it, every time. These are not sophisticated things to know. They are, in fact, the simplest things, the oldest things, the things that every tradition in every culture that has ever thought carefully about how to live has eventually arrived at, through whatever route it took. Epicurus arrived here through philosophy. The Zen teachers arrived here through meditation. Marcus Aurelius arrived here through decades of disciplined self-examination. Walt Whitman arrived here through poetry and democracy and the open road. Peter Griffin arrived here through beer and television, and a very quiet inner critic, and the specific grace of a life that kept offering him exactly what he needed to be content, and the further grace of a nature that was able to receive it. One must imagine Peter Griffin happy. Not because his life is perfect, not because his choices are admirable, not because he has earned happiness through virtue or achieved it through effort, but because happiness, in its deepest and most durable form, is not a reward for anything. It is not something you get when you have finally done enough of the right things. It is a relationship with the life you actually have. And Peter Griffin, in his accidental and irreproducible way, has that relationship. He has it in full. The couch is warm, the beer is cold, the television is on, the family is asleep upstairs. The friends are just a walk away and will be in the bar tomorrow. The night is doing its slow and generous work of making everything quiet. Everything, for Peter Griffin, is enough. Everything, for all of us who have followed him here tonight, can be enough too. If we let it. Sleep well. We mean it this time. And if this kept you company tonight, if this long, slow, philosophical walk through the inner life of a large man in a green shirt gave your mind somewhere gentle to go, leave a like and subscribe. There are more of these waiting, more long nights, and more unlikely philosophical guides. We will be here. Good night. Closing meditations. The long night and the thinking that fills it. What animated comedy does that other forms cannot? There is a reason we are talking about Peter Griffin rather than, say, a character from a prestige drama. There is a reason this particular vessel for philosophical exploration is a cartoon man in a green shirt rather than a protagonist in a serious literary novel. And the reason is worth understanding. Because it has to do with something animated comedy can do that almost no other form of storytelling can manage. Animated comedy operates under a different set of physical laws than realistic drama. Characters survive things that would kill any living creature. They recover from injuries in the time it takes for the next scene to begin. They experience consequences that are exaggerated beyond all proportion to the cause. They exist in a world that runs according to the logic of what is funny, rather than the logic of what is real. And this operates, for the audience, as a kind of permission. When you watch a realistic drama and a character suffers, you suffer with them. The realism creates a bridge between the story and your own experience of pain. You bring your own history of loss and fear and grief to the character's loss and fear and grief, and the thing that is made in that meeting is something like empathy but also something like vulnerability. You have been opened by the story. The opening is the point. But it costs something. When you watch Peter Griffin drive a car off a cliff and walk away confused, you laugh. The cartoon logic has suspended the consequence. The thing that would be devastating in a realistic frame is funny in the animated frame, because the animated frame has already told you that the laws of cause and effect are being gently suspended for the duration. You are safe. Nothing that happens here is going to reach through the screen and cost you something. And because you are safe, something interesting becomes possible. You can look at things in the cartoon that you would be too defended to look at in a realistic frame. The appetite and the impulse and the failure and the unkindness, these things in a realistic drama require your defenses because they're coming for you through the realism. In a cartoon, they're over there, on the other side of the animated boundary, and they can't get through, which paradoxically means you can look at them more directly than you could otherwise. Peter Griffin's appetite is yours. His failure to live up to his own best intentions is yours. His occasional cruelty toward the people he loves is yours. His refusal to grow up in certain specific ways is yours. His deep need for the same people in the same places is yours. All of it, every embarrassing and recognizable and human thing about him, is yours. But the cartoon protects you from having to fully admit it. You can laugh at it instead. And in the laughing, in the safe acknowledgement that this ridiculous large man is doing the ridiculous thing you also sometimes do, something is released. The self-judgment that usually accompanies the recognition, the should-know-better voice, the disappointed adult voice, that voice is silenced by the comedy. The recognition happens without the punishment, and what's left is something lighter. This is the specific philosophical gift of the animated comedy. It creates a space where the most embarrassing truths about being human can be visited without the full weight of shame that they usually carry. Peter Griffin is the embarrassing truth with the shame removed. And in that removal, something healing becomes possible. You are seen in your appetite and your foolishness and your longing for simple things. And the seeing is not devastating. It is funny. Which is to say, it is survivable. Which is to say, it is okay. This is not a small thing. The capacity to look at your own limitation without being destroyed by the looking is one of the foundational elements of psychological health. It is what the therapists are working toward, and what the meditation teachers are pointing at, and what the Stoics were training themselves in. The ability to see clearly without the seeing being a catastrophe. The ability to know the truth about yourself and find that the truth, while not flattering, is not fatal. Peter Griffin teaches this by example, across decades. Without knowing he's teaching anything, he is the failure that survives, the fool that endures, the appetite that is not a shame but a fact. And in watching him be all of these things, we practice, a little bit, the art of being them in ourselves without the usual weight. The long view, 25 years of the same man. By the time you finish watching everything that has been made, Peter Griffin will have been on screen for more combined hours than almost any character in the history of television. Thousands of minutes. The same face, the same voice, the same appetites and loyalties and failures across a span of time that covers an enormous stretch of American cultural life. Think about what that means in terms of the character's relationship with the audience. For many people who grew up watching Family Guy, Peter Griffin has been a consistent presence across a larger part of their lives than almost any real person. He was there in their teens and their 20s and their 30s. He was there through the personal changes and the cultural changes and the years that felt long and the years that went fast. He was always in the same house, always with the same family, always at the same bar. There is something important about consistency across long time that deserves philosophical attention. The philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, in his book After Virtue, argued that human lives are only intelligible as narratives, that the self is not a static thing but a story, something that only makes sense when you can see its arc across time, and that the moral life, the life conducted with integrity and virtue, requires a kind of narrative consistency. The person who keeps their promises is the person whose future self is recognizable to their past self. The person who betrays their commitments has broken the narrative thread, has become discontinuous with who they were. Peter Griffin's narrative is wild with discontinuity at the plot level. Things happen and reset and happen again in ways that make a coherent causal narrative almost impossible to construct. But his character is remarkably continuous. He is always the same Peter, the same man with the same loves and the same failures, and the same fundamental orientation toward the people in his life. The surface is chaotic. The core is unchanged. This character continuity across 25 years of episodes is part of why the character creates such a strong sense of companionship in the audience. He is someone they know. Not someone they know about, but someone they know, in the way you know a person whose behavior has become legible to you, whose reactions you can predict, whose specific kind of love and failure you have learned to read. The knowing has accumulated through the repetition of encounter, the same way all genuine knowing of a person accumulates. And now, tonight, he is here with you. In the quiet of your room, in the late hour that makes everything slightly more honest and slightly more gentle than it is in the middle of the day. He is the presence that your mind can rest on when it needs something to rest on that doesn't require you to perform anything. He is the companion for the hour, when companions are needed and the world's louder offerings are unavailable. This is what Peter Griffin is for. Not just for the laughs, which are real and good, but for the company of a creature who is fully himself, consistently and without apology, across every episode and every year and every stage of your own life that has run parallel to his. The company of someone who keeps showing up, who is always at the bar, always on the couch, always hungry and usually wrong and occasionally accidentally right, always pointed toward the people he loves with the specific gravity of someone who has, however inadvertently, figured out that these people are the point. He is good company for the late hours. He is good company for the long haul. The very last thing, there is a moment near the end of many Family Guy episodes, after the chaos has resolved and the lesson has either been learned or conspicuously not learned, where the Griffin family is together in some version of their normal configuration. The kitchen or the living room or the front lawn. Together, not performing togetherness, just existing in the proximity of each other in the way that families do when the episode of the day has run its course. These moments are brief. The show does not linger on them. There is a reason for that. Comedy does not stop for sentiment too long without ceasing to be comedy. But in those moments, between the last laugh of the episode and the credit sequence, there is sometimes just a beat of something real. A beat of 4 people and a dog and an evil genius baby who is not quite as evil as he used to be, and a large man in a green shirt, and all of them in the specific warmth of a house that they have damaged and repaired, and damaged and repaired, and it is enough. It is always enough. Whatever you are carrying tonight, into your sleep and your rest and the quiet hours, I want to leave you with that beat. The beat between the chaos and the credits. The moment when the house is still and the people are together and nobody is demanding anything from the moment except that it continue a little while longer. You deserve that beat. You deserve the permission to let the day's chaos be over, to let the reset arrive, to carry nothing heavier than the warmth of the room and the knowledge that tomorrow will begin again in its own way. Sleep now. The philosophy will keep. The beer will be cold again tomorrow. The bar will open at the usual time. The same faces will be in the same stools, and Peter Griffin will be on the couch, arm hanging toward the carpet, at peace. As you should be. As you can be. Good night. If this video found you at the right moment, please subscribe and leave a like. It helps more than you know. We'll be here for the next long night, with another unlikely guide through the questions that the quiet hours bring. End of script. The philosophy of Peter Griffin, to fall asleep. A note on what comfort really is. One more thing, before we are truly done. Comfort gets dismissed a lot. In the language of self-improvement, comfort is the enemy. The comfort zone is the place you are supposed to leave. Being comfortable is code for being stagnant, for having stopped growing, for having accepted less than you could be reaching for. The culture of growth and optimization has made comfort into a kind of sin, a failure of ambition that the ambitious are entitled to look down on. I want to push back against this. Not in the name of complacency, not in the name of refusing to grow or learn or change, but in the name of the thing that comfort actually is when it is real. Real comfort is not the absence of challenge. It is not the refusal to feel. It is not hiding from difficulty behind the false safety of never trying anything hard. Real comfort is something much more specific and much more valuable. It is the felt sense that you are, in this moment, held. That the structure of your life, however imperfect and however subject to change and disruption, is basically solid, that the people around you are basically trustworthy, that the place you occupy in the world is basically yours, that you are not, in the deepest sense, alone. This is what Peter Griffin has. Not all the time. The show is a comedy, and the comedy requires the disruption of exactly this comfort, repeatedly and entertainingly. But as a background condition, as the thing that keeps getting restored after each disruption, Peter has the felt sense of being held. By his family, however chaotic. By his friends, however imperfect. By his bar, however fictional. By his neighborhood, however absurd. By his life, however repeatedly sent into crisis by his own actions. He is held. And from the holding, he keeps bouncing back. This is the deepest argument for the philosophical value of Peter Griffin as a figure. Not the Epicurean pleasure efficiency. Not the accidental mindfulness. Not the trickster's creative chaos. All of those are real, but underneath all of them is this: a man who is held, who has built, without intending to build anything, a life that holds him, who has surrounded himself with the structures of love and belonging that make it possible to bounce back from anything, because there is always somewhere and someone to bounce back to. The building of that kind of life is, when you look at it clearly, the most important philosophical project available to a human being. Not the building of achievement or the accumulation of status or the optimization of performance, the building of the structures that hold you. The relationships, the places, the rituals, the commitments, the daily practices of showing up that, accumulated over years, become the ground that everything else stands on. Peter didn't build this deliberately. He built it by being himself, by wanting what he wanted, by going where the people he loved were. But the structure is real and solid, and it has held him through everything the show has thrown at him. And in watching that structure hold him, we are reminded that it is possible, that the held life is available, that the warmth of belonging, when it is real, is not fragile. Build yours, in whatever form it takes. Whatever version of the bar, and the family, and the friends, and the couch is available to you. Build the structure that holds you. And then, tonight, rest in it. The building will continue tomorrow. Tonight is for resting. Good night, genuinely. On what gets left out when we try too hard to be interesting? There is a version of a YouTube video about philosophy that announces itself as philosophy from the first frame. It opens with dramatic music and quick cuts between shots of ancient busts and starry skies, and the host wearing a thoughtful expression in front of a carefully curated bookshelf. It uses the word epistemology within the first 30 seconds. It references 3 philosophers in the opening paragraph and italicizes their names. It is trying, very visibly, to be interesting and serious and worth your time. And sometimes those videos are genuinely good. Sometimes the effort produces something real and worth watching. But there is a particular quality that they almost never have, and it is the quality that Peter Griffin, as a subject, allows for. The quality of arrival at something true without having set out to arrive there. The quality of a thought that surprised the thinker. The quality of stumbling across the thing rather than striding toward it. The best ideas I have ever encountered came sideways. They came while reading something written for a completely different purpose, and a sentence in the middle of the 3rd chapter said something that had nothing to do with what I was supposed to be thinking about, and the thing it said was exactly what I needed to hear in that specific moment of my specific life. The directness of the approach to ideas is often inversely proportional to the depth of the encounter. When you go straight at a thing, it often ducks out of the way. When you come at it obliquely, through beer and a couch and an animated man in Rhode Island, it sometimes sits still long enough for you to see it. Peter Griffin as a philosophical subject works because he is not trying to be one. He is trying to watch television and drink beer. The philosophy is found in him the way a fossil is found in stone, not placed there deliberately, but present nonetheless, requiring only the right kind of attention to become visible. And this is an argument for the value of a certain kind of attention that our culture doesn't encourage nearly enough. The attention that doesn't know in advance what it is looking for. The attention that is willing to follow something apparently trivial to the place it actually leads. The attention that can look at a large man on a beige couch and see, without straining or pretending, something that Aristotle and Epicurus and Whitman and Camus and Kierkegaard and Marcus Aurelius and the teachers of a dozen contemplative traditions were all, in their different languages and their different centuries, also trying to say, the thing they were all trying to say is not complicated. Every philosophical tradition eventually arrives at a version of the same simple thing, which is that the life worth living is the life actually lived, in the specific and unglamorous and completely ordinary way that actual lives are lived. Not the life optimized and performed and aimed at a destination always slightly further away. The life that is here, now, with the people and the pleasures and the limitations that are actually yours. Peter Griffin lives this life, without knowing he's living it, without trying to live it philosophically. He just lives it, which is the only way it can actually be lived. And in the watching of it, across 25 years of episodes and all the hours that watching represents, something is transmitted. Not a lesson, exactly. Not a set of instructions. Something softer and more immediate. A reminder. A reminder that the life you have is enough for the life you need to have. If you can find the specific and difficult and absolutely available grace of accepting what you have been given and being present in it and calling it, without irony and without apology, enough. One must imagine Peter Griffin happy. And one can. Because he is. Good night.